How does a nation of barely 1 million people come to rule over 50 million across 4 continents? How does a country smaller than most American states establish the longest-lived European empire in history? Tonight, unravel this impossible contradiction. Portugal, a narrow strip of Atlantic coastline that somehow casts shadows across the entire globe. While mighty France and England remained locked in medieval squabbles, these Western Europeans were establishing trading posts in India, converting Japanese daimyo to Christianity, and shipping African gold to finance cathedrals in Lisbon. For 6 centuries, this tiny kingdom punched far above its weight, creating the template for a global empire that others would follow. As your eyes grow heavy, let this paradox guide you through a story of impossible ambitions made real, of how geography and determination can reshape the destiny of nations. Like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also comment where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. In the mists of medieval Iberia, where Christian kingdoms pressed against Muslim taifas in an endless dance of conquest and reconquest, few could have imagined that the westernmost edge of this fragmented peninsula would birth a maritime empire spanning 6 continents. The story begins not with ships or spices, but with the slow, grinding centuries of the Reconquista, that great Christian crusade to reclaim Iberian lands from Islamic rule. Here, in the clash of sword against scimitar, in the patient construction of fortified towns along contested frontiers, in the gradual crystallization of Portuguese identity, distinct from its Castilian neighbours, lay the foundational experiences that would prepare a small Atlantic kingdom for unprecedented global expansion. The political entity we know as Portugal emerged from the broader Christian reconquest like a river, finding its course through mountainous terrain. In the early 12th century, Henry of Burgundy, a French nobleman drawn south by the promise of land and glory in the fight against the Moors, received from Alfonso VI of Leon the county of Portugal as reward for military service. This territory, stretching roughly from the Minho River to the Mondego, encompassed the ancient Roman cities of Braga and Porto, from which the region derived its name. When Henry died in 1112, his widow Teresa claimed regency for their infant son Afonso Henriques, setting in motion events that would transform a frontier county into an independent kingdom. Afonso Henriques possessed the particular combination of military prowess, political cunning, and strategic vision that marked the great medieval state builders. As he came of age in the 1120s, the young count found himself caught between competing loyalties to his mother's authority, to his suzerain Alfonso VII of Leon and Castile, and to his own growing ambitions. The political landscape of Christian Iberia was fluid, marked by shifting alliances between kingdoms that viewed Muslim territories as legitimate targets for expansion, but frequently warred among themselves over the spoils. In this environment, Afonso Henriques recognized that independence required not merely military victory, but sustained political maneuvering and the cultivation of external support. The decisive break came at the Battle of Salmameday in 1128, where Afonso Henriques defeated forces loyal to his mother Teresa and her Galician lover Fernando Pérez de Trava. This victory established his undisputed control over the county of Portugal, but independence from Leon required further struggle. For over a decade, Afonso Henriques consolidated his power base, strengthened frontier fortifications, and cultivated support from the nascent military orders, the Knights Templar and the Order of Calatrava, whose warrior monks brought both military expertise and international connections to his cause. The chroniclers of the period, writing with the benefit of hindsight, would cast these years as the inevitable unfolding of divine providence. But contemporary sources reveal the uncertainty and careful calculation that characterized Afonso's gradual assumption of royal prerogatives. The pivotal moment arrived on July 25, 1139, at the Battle of Urique, where Afonso Henriques led Portuguese forces against a much larger Almoravid army, commanded by 5 Muslim kings. The Portuguese victory achieved through superior tactics, favourable terrain, and what contemporary sources described as miraculous intervention, transformed the political dynamics of Western Iberia. According to later legend, refined and embellished by successive generations of chroniclers, Christ himself appeared to Afonso before the battle, promising victory and commanding him to take the title of king. Whether or not such divine visitation occurred, the aftermath of Eurique saw Afonso Henriques proclaimed king by his nobles, marking Portugal's transition from county to kingdom. Recognition of this independence required decades of diplomatic effort. The new Kingdom of Portugal existed in a precarious position, pressed between the expanding power of Leon Castile to the east and the continuing Muslim presence to the south. Afonso III, as he now styled himself, pursued a multifaceted strategy combining military pressure against Muslim territories, diplomatic overtures to the Pope seeking recognition of his royal title, and careful management of relations with neighbouring Christian kingdoms. The papal bull Manifestis Probatum of 1179 finally granted formal recognition to the Kingdom of Portugal and its dynasty, placing it under direct papal protection, a crucial diplomatic victory that provided international legitimacy and helped shield the nascent kingdom from Castilian absorption. The consolidation of Portuguese independence coincided with the kingdom's expansion southward into territories previously held by Muslim rulers. The conquest of Santarém in 1147 and Lisbon later that same year marked decisive phases in this expansion. The siege of Lisbon, accomplished with the aid of Crusader forces bound for the Holy Land who had been persuaded to delay their journey, demonstrated the intersection of local Reconquista warfare with broader European Christian militancy. The city's capture provided Portugal with one of Iberia's finest natural harbours and established Lisbon as the kingdom's eventual capital, though this transition from the northern city of Coimbra occurred gradually over subsequent decades. The southern expansion continued under Afonso's successors, though progress proved neither steady nor uniform. Muslim resistance remained formidable, particularly from the Almohad dynasty that had succeeded Almoravid rule in Al-Andalus. Portuguese forces suffered significant defeats, including the catastrophic Battle of Alarcos in 1195, where Almohad armies decimated a combined Castilian-Portuguese force. Such setbacks reminded the Portuguese nobility that their kingdom's survival depended on careful strategy rather than reckless aggression. The final conquest of the Algarve under Afonso III in the mid-13th century completed the territorial formation of continental Portugal, establishing boundaries that have remained essentially unchanged to the present day, a remarkable achievement of medieval state-building. This centuries-long process of territorial consolidation shaped Portuguese political culture in ways that would prove crucial for later imperial expansion. The constant warfare of the Reconquista fostered a nobility experienced in military command, accustomed to long campaigns in unfamiliar territories, and comfortable with the incorporation of diverse populations under Portuguese rule. The integration of Muslim Mudéjar communities and Jewish populations demonstrated a pragmatic approach to religious and cultural diversity that contrasted with the more rigid orthodoxy that characterized some other European kingdoms. The military orders established powerful presences along the frontier, developing organizational structures and maritime interests that would later support overseas expansion. Equally important was Portugal's geographic position on the Atlantic periphery of Europe. While this location initially seemed disadvantageous, placing the kingdom far from the major trade routes linking northern Europe with the Mediterranean, it ultimately proved providential. Portuguese ports faced the open ocean rather than enclosed seas, and the kingdom's merchants developed expertise in Atlantic navigation while their Mediterranean counterparts focused on more familiar routes. The fishing communities of the northern coast, particularly around Porto and Aveiro, possessed intimate knowledge of Atlantic winds and currents that would prove invaluable when Portuguese exploration moved beyond coastal waters. The transition from Reconquista warfare to Atlantic exploration occurred gradually during the 14th century, influenced by political, economic, and technological developments that converged to make oceanic ventures both feasible and attractive. The completion of territorial consolidation removed the immediate military imperative that had dominated Portuguese policy for 2 centuries, freeing resources and attention for other endeavours. Simultaneously, the growth of Portuguese commerce, particularly the export of wine, salt and fish to northern European markets, created merchant communities with capital to invest in speculative ventures and familiarity with international trade networks. The reign of King Dinis, 1279–1325, marked a crucial transitional period in Portuguese development. Known as the Farmer King for his attention to agricultural improvement and internal development, Dinis also made decisive investments in maritime infrastructure and naval capabilities. His creation of a Portuguese navy, initially intended to protect merchant shipping from Muslim pirates operating from North African bases, established institutional foundations for later oceanic exploration. The king's cultivation of commercial relations with Genoa brought Italian navigational expertise and financial techniques to Portugal, while his promotion of Portuguese language and literature fostered a distinct national culture that could sustain imperial ambitions. The 14th century also witnessed crucial technological developments that made Atlantic exploration feasible. Portuguese shipwrights, drawing on Mediterranean and Northern European traditions, developed increasingly sophisticated vessels capable of oceanic navigation. The evolution of the caravella light maneuverable ship with lateen rigging that could sail close to the wind provided the technological foundation for systematic exploration of the African coast. Improvements in navigational instruments, particularly the astrolabe and magnetic compass, enabled Portuguese navigators to venture beyond sight of land with reasonable confidence in their ability to return. Perhaps most importantly, the 14th century saw the emergence of systematic thinking about Atlantic exploration as a coherent enterprise rather than random adventure. The theoretical groundwork was laid by scholars at the nascent University of Coimbra and in the monasteries where ancient geographical texts were preserved and studied. Portuguese intellectuals absorbed classical works by Ptolemy and Pliny, medieval Arab geographical treatises, and contemporary Italian commercial intelligence to develop increasingly sophisticated understanding of global geography and the potential for oceanic trade routes. The political crisis that engulfed Portugal in the late 14th century paradoxically strengthened the kingdom's capacity for Atlantic expansion. The succession crisis following the death of King Ferdinand in 1383 and the subsequent war against Castilian claims to the Portuguese throne culminated in the victory of João of Aviz at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385. This triumph, achieved with English military support that formalized the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, established the Aviz dynasty and created a new generation of noble families whose wealth and status depended on royal favor rather than inherited lands. These nueva nobility possessed both the resources and incentives to support speculative ventures that might bring glory and profit to the crown. The stage was thus set for the remarkable transformation that would occur under the early Aviz monarchs, particularly Prince Henry the Navigator, whose systematic patronage of exploration would launch Portugal into the Atlantic and ultimately around the globe. The foundations laid during the Reconquista military expertise, administrative competence, maritime experience, and cultural adaptability would prove invaluable as Portugal embarked on enterprises that dwarfed even the most ambitious dreams of the medieval kings who first carved this small kingdom from the contested frontiers of Iberia. The winds that had carried Portuguese fishing vessels beyond sight of land for generations began to whisper of greater possibilities as the 14th century drew to its close. What had been necessity, the search for cod in the treacherous waters beyond Cape Finisterre, gradually transformed into systematic curiosity about the ocean's hidden reaches. The same maritime skills that enabled Portuguese fishermen to return safely from weeks-long voyages to the Grand Banks now suggested that the Atlantic itself might serve as a highway to wealth and glory, rather than merely a barrier to be endured. Prince Henry, third son of João III and hero of the conquest of Ceuta, possessed the particular combination of religious fervour, commercial ambition, and intellectual curiosity that characterized the early phase of Portuguese oceanic exploration. Following his participation in the successful assault on the North African stronghold in 1415, Portugal's first overseas territorial acquisition, Henry withdrew to the windswept promontory of Sagres, establishing a court that would coordinate Portuguese exploration for nearly half a century. The prince's residence at this remote southwestern cape placed him at the literal edge of the known world, where the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward horizons that medieval geographers populated with monsters and miracles in equal measure. The systematic nature of Henrian exploration emerged gradually from the convergence of practical necessity, religious obligation, and commercial opportunity that characterized Portuguese engagement with the wider world during the early 15th century. The conquest of Ceuta had provided Portuguese forces with their first direct contact with the trans-Saharan trade routes that brought West African gold to Mediterranean markets, revealing the wealth that flowed northward through Muslim-controlled territories. Henry's subsequent expeditions down the African coast represented attempts to reach these sources of wealth directly, bypassing Muslim intermediaries while extending Portuguese territorial control and Christian influence into regions previously dominated by Islamic civilization. The technological innovations that made systematic Atlantic exploration feasible reflected Portuguese synthesis of Mediterranean and Atlantic maritime traditions within the specific context of oceanic navigation requirements. The evolution of the caravel during the early 15th century provided Portuguese navigators with vessels capable of extended oceanic voyages while remaining sufficiently maneuverable for coastal exploration and river navigation. These ships, combining the lateen rigging traditional to Mediterranean vessels with hull designs adapted to Atlantic conditions, enabled Portuguese expeditions to sail closer to contrary winds, while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for return voyages across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Navigation techniques developed for Atlantic exploration required fundamental innovations in maritime instrumentation and celestial observation that extended far beyond the coastal piloting methods adequate for Mediterranean navigation. Portuguese navigators, working with Jewish and Muslim astronomers whose knowledge of celestial mathematics exceeded contemporary Christian expertise, developed increasingly sophisticated methods for determining latitude while sailing beyond sight of familiar landmarks. The systematic recording of wind patterns, current directions, and coastal features created accumulated geographical knowledge that enabled each successive expedition to venture further than its predecessors, while maintaining reasonable confidence in successful return. The psychological barriers that initially limited Portuguese Atlantic exploration proved as formidable as the practical challenges of oceanic navigation. Medieval European maritime culture harbored deep fears about the consequences of sailing too far from familiar waters, while classical and medieval authorities provided contradictory and often terrifying descriptions of what lay beyond the known world. The persistent belief that waters south of Cape Bojador would boil any vessel unfortunate enough to enter them reflected broader European assumptions about the uninhabitable nature of tropical regions, assumptions that required systematic disproof through actual navigation rather than theoretical argument. Gil Eanes's successful passage beyond Cape Bojador in 1434 represented a crucial psychological breakthrough that demonstrated the possibility of safe return from waters previously considered deadly to Christian navigation. The expedition's return with evidence of normal oceanic conditions beyond the feared cape encouraged subsequent Portuguese ventures to push progressively further southward, each voyage building upon the accumulated experience and geographical knowledge of its predecessors. The systematic nature of this exploration, with each expedition extending Portuguese knowledge by relatively modest increments, distinguished Henrican exploration from the spectacular but isolated voyages that characterized some later periods of European discovery. The commercial possibilities revealed by early Portuguese exploration along the West African coast provided the economic foundation for more ambitious ventures, while demonstrating the potential profits available from direct contact with African societies. Portuguese expeditions of the 1440s began returning with gold dust, ivory, and enslaved Africans, whose sale in European markets generated revenues that justified continued investment in exploration. The establishment of Portuguese trading posts along the West African coast created permanent bases for further exploration, while providing local sources of supplies and intelligence about conditions further south. The cultural encounters that accompanied early Portuguese exploration established patterns of European-African interaction that would influence colonial development for centuries. Portuguese explorers, lacking the military superiority that would characterize later phases of European expansion, initially approached African societies as commercial partners rather than subjects for conquest. The necessity of negotiating trading agreements with African rulers and merchants created relationships of mutual dependence that contrasted sharply with the more exploitative patterns that would emerge once Portuguese military advantages became more decisive. The integration of early Atlantic exploration with Portuguese domestic political development created institutional foundations for systematic colonial expansion that extended far beyond the personal vision of Prince Henry. The profits generated by African trade attracted investment from Portuguese merchants and nobles whose commercial interests provided political support for continued exploration, while the prestige associated with geographical discovery enhanced royal authority and national pride. The establishment of royal monopolies over certain aspects of African trade ensured crown revenues from exploration, while creating administrative precedents for managing colonial territories. The death of Prince Henry in 1460 marked the end of the heroic phase of Portuguese exploration, but not the termination of Portuguese expansion into the Atlantic. The institutional structures and commercial relationships established during the Henrican period provided the foundation for the more ambitious expeditions that would round the Cape of Good Hope and establish direct contact with Asian civilizations. The techniques of oceanic navigation, the patterns of colonial administration, and the commercial networks developed during the early phases of Atlantic exploration created the essential preconditions for Portugal's transformation from a small European kingdom into the world's first global maritime empire. The transformation of Portugal from a small Atlantic kingdom into the world's first global maritime empire began with a single, seemingly modest ambition: to reach the gold mines of West Africa without paying tribute to Muslim intermediaries. Prince Henry the Navigator, third son of King John I, established his court at Sagres on Portugal's southwestern cape around 1420, creating what medieval chroniclers would later mythologize as a school of navigation, but which functioned more accurately as a coordination center for systematic Atlantic exploration. From this windswept promontory, where the Atlantic stretched endlessly westward and southward beyond the known world, Henry directed a decades-long campaign to push Portuguese ships progressively further along the African coast, each voyage building upon the knowledge accumulated by its predecessors. The early decades of this enterprise required extraordinary patience and persistence, for the African coast seemed to stretch interminably southward, without any indication that it might eventually curve eastward toward the Indian Ocean. Portuguese navigators, working with crude maps and unreliable classical sources, had no certain knowledge that Africa was circumnavigable. Ancient authorities disagreed about continental geography. Ptolemy suggested that Africa extended indefinitely southward, connecting with an unknown southern continent, while other sources hinted at the possibility of an all-water route to Asia. Each Portuguese expedition ventured slightly further than its predecessor, establishing the gradual accumulation of geographical knowledge that characterized Henry's methodical approach to exploration. The psychological barriers proved as formidable as the practical ones. Medieval European sailors harbored deep fears about the consequences of sailing too far south along the African coast. The Sea of Darkness beyond Cape Bojador was rumoured to contain boiling waters that would cook any mariner foolish enough to venture there, while the intense heat of the tropical zones was believed to transform human skin black and render Christian souls susceptible to demonic possession. When Gilles finally rounded Cape Bojador in 1434, returning safely to Portugal with no evidence of supernatural dangers, he demolished one of the primary psychological obstacles to further southern exploration. The breakthrough that transformed Portuguese exploration from cautious coastal probing into systematic penetration of the South Atlantic occurred during the 1440s, when Portuguese navigators discovered the techniques necessary for successful return voyages from the African coast. The prevailing northerly winds along the African coast made it relatively easy to sail south, but extremely difficult to return northward using coastal routes. Portuguese pilots solved this problem by developing the volta do mar, the turn of the sea, a navigational technique that involved sailing far westward into the Atlantic to catch favourable winds for the northward return to Portugal. This innovation required extraordinary courage, as it meant sailing for weeks beyond sight of land in the open ocean, but it made possible the systematic exploration of the entire African coast. By the 1460s, Portuguese expeditions had established trading posts along the West African coast and were bringing increasing quantities of gold, ivory and slaves back to Lisbon. The profits from this trade vindicated Henry's investment in exploration and provided the economic foundation for more ambitious ventures. When Prince Henry died in 1460, Portuguese explorers had penetrated as far south as Sierra Leone, but the most dramatic phase of African exploration lay ahead under the direction of subsequent monarchs who inherited both Henry's systematic approach and the accumulated expertise of decades of Atlantic navigation. The decisive breakthrough came under King Juan II, whose reign from 1481 to 1495 witnessed the completion of the African circumnavigation and the establishment of direct contact with Asia. Juan II, known as the Perfect Prince, combined Henry's passion for exploration with superior political skills and more sophisticated understanding of global geography. The king established a permanent commission of mathematical experts to advise on navigational matters and commissioned improved maps and instruments based on the most recent Portuguese discoveries. Under his direction, Portuguese exploration became less a matter of individual heroism and more a coordinated state enterprise utilizing the kingdom's accumulated wealth and expertise. Bartolomeu Dias achieved the crucial breakthrough in 1488 when his expedition, after battling fierce storms off the South African coast, discovered that the African continent did indeed curve eastward toward the Indian Ocean. Dias named the southern cape Cabo Tormentoso, the Cape of Storms, in recognition of the fierce weather his ships had endured. But King Juan II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, reflecting his optimism about the commercial possibilities that African circumnavigation would create. When Dias returned to Lisbon with news that the sea route to Asia lay open, Portuguese merchants and nobles began planning expeditions that would bypass the Ottoman-controlled eastern Mediterranean entirely. Vasco da Gama's expedition of 1497-1499 completed what Henry the Navigator had begun nearly 8 decades earlier. Da Gama, commanding 4 ships and 170 men, sailed from Lisbon with specific instructions to establish direct trading relations with the Christian kingdoms and wealthy merchants that Portuguese intelligence suggested dominated Indian Ocean commerce. The voyage required over 10 months of sailing, including an extended stay at St. Helena Bay on the South African coast to repair ships and rest the crew before attempting the final passage around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean to India. The arrival of da Gama's fleet at Calicut on India's Malabar coast in May 1498 represented one of history's most significant moments of cross-cultural encounter. The Portuguese, expecting to find Christian kingdoms dominated by European-style merchants, instead discovered a sophisticated commercial civilization dominated by Muslim traders backed by Hindu rulers who showed little interest in European goods or Christian conversion. The Zamorin of Calicut, accustomed to receiving valuable gold, silver and manufactured goods from Arab and Indian merchants, dismissed the Portuguese offerings of cloth and trinkets as unworthy of serious commercial consideration. Despite these initial commercial disappointments, da Gama's expedition succeeded in establishing the crucial precedent of direct Portuguese contact with Asian markets. When the surviving ships returned to Lisbon in 1499, only 2 of the original 4 completed the return voyage. They carried small quantities of pepper, cinnamon, and other spices that sold for prices far exceeding the expedition's total cost. More importantly, they brought detailed intelligence about Indian Ocean trade routes, political conditions, and the military capabilities of various Asian rulers. This information enabled King Manuel to plan the systematic conquest and colonization that would transform Portugal's initial trading contact into territorial empire. The Portuguese discovery of Brazil exemplifies the intersection of careful planning and historical accident that characterized much of early modern exploration. Pedro Álvares Cabral's expedition of 1500, officially dispatched to establish permanent Portuguese trading posts in India, stumbled upon the South American coastline through a combination of navigational error, Atlantic weather patterns, and the vast scale of oceanic distances that 16th-century Europeans still imperfectly understood. What began as a deviation from Cabral's intended route to India became the foundation for Portugal's largest and most enduring colonial possession. King Manuel I had commissioned Cabral to follow up on Vasco da Gama's pioneering voyage by establishing permanent Portuguese factories along the Indian coast and negotiating favourable trading agreements with Asian rulers. The expedition, comprising 13 ships and approximately 1,200 men, represented the largest Portuguese maritime venture to that date, reflecting the king's determination to establish Portugal as the dominant European power in Asian trade. Cabral's fleet included experienced navigators who had participated in previous Indian Ocean voyages, military commanders prepared to impose Portuguese terms on reluctant Asian partners, and Franciscan missionaries charged with investigating opportunities for Christian conversion. Following standard Portuguese practice for Indian Ocean voyages, Cabral's fleet sailed southwest from the Canary Islands to catch favourable winds for the passage around the Cape of Good Hope. This route, perfected through decades of Portuguese navigation, involved sailing far westward into the South Atlantic before turning southward toward the African coast, a technique that minimized the time ships spent fighting contrary winds and currents along the African coastline. However, prevailing winds and currents carried Cabral's fleet much further westward than intended, bringing the Portuguese into contact with the South American coast somewhere in the vicinity of present-day Porto Seguro. The Portuguese initially interpreted this landfall as the discovery of a large island, similar to the Atlantic islands that previous expeditions had encountered and claimed for Portugal. Cabral dispatched small boats to investigate the coastline and make contact with indigenous inhabitants, following standard Portuguese procedures for evaluating newly discovered territories. The expedition's official chronicler, Pero Vaz de Caminha, composed a detailed letter to King Manuel describing the land's apparent fertility, the physical appearance and cultural practices of its inhabitants, and the potential for Portuguese settlement and Christian missionary activity. Caminha's letter reveals the Portuguese attempting to understand this unexpected discovery within familiar frameworks of European colonial expansion. The indigenous inhabitants, whom the Portuguese initially called Indians in the mistaken belief that they had reached islands off the Asian coast, appeared to live in a state of natural innocence that reminded Portuguese observers of biblical descriptions of Eden. The apparent absence of organized agriculture, permanent settlements, or complex political institutions suggested to Portuguese eyes a primitive society that could be easily dominated and converted to Christianity. The land itself appeared extraordinarily fertile, with abundant fresh water, dense forests, and wildlife that exceeded European variety and abundance. The Portuguese spent approximately 10 days investigating this unexpected discovery before continuing their voyage to India. Cabral claimed the territory for Portugal, erected a wooden cross marking Portuguese sovereignty, and dispatched one ship back to Lisbon with news of the discovery, while the remainder of his fleet continued toward the Cape of Good Hope. The decision to send immediate notification to the Portuguese court reflected recognition that this discovery might possess significant strategic and economic value, even though its exact geographical relationship to known continents remained unclear. The rapid Portuguese notification of their South American discovery proved prescient, for the territory lay within the zone allocated to Portugal by the Treaty of Tordesillas, negotiated with Spain in 1494 to divide newly discovered territories between the two Iberian powers. The treaty had established an imaginary line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, granting Spain rights to territories west of this line and Portugal rights to territories east of it. Although the negotiators had intended this division primarily to resolve competing claims to Atlantic islands and African territories, the inclusion of East and South America within the Portuguese zone provided legal foundation for subsequent Brazilian colonization. Initial Portuguese assessment of Brazil suggested limited immediate commercial value compared to the spice wealth of Asia. The territory appeared to lack the gold and silver that had enriched Spanish conquests in Mexico and Peru, while its indigenous inhabitants possessed none of the sophisticated manufacturing capabilities that characterized Asian societies. Brazilian products that attracted early Portuguese attention, primarily Brazil wood, from which the territory derived its name, and exotic parrots prized by European collectors, generated modest profits compared to the spectacular returns available from Asian spice trade. However, Brazil's agricultural potential became apparent as Portuguese settlers began experimenting with sugar cultivation using techniques and labour systems developed in the Atlantic islands. The territory's vast size, favourable climate and indigenous labour supply created possibilities for plantation agriculture on a scale impossible in Portugal's smaller Atlantic possessions. By the mid-16th century, Brazilian sugar exports were generating substantial revenues for the Portuguese crown, transforming what had initially seemed a commercially marginal discovery into one of Europe's most valuable colonial territories. The systematic expansion of Portuguese power throughout the Indian Ocean during the early 16th century represented a masterpiece of strategic planning executed with limited resources across unprecedented geographical distances. Afonso de Albuquerque, who served as Portuguese governor of India from 1509 to 1515, transformed da Gama's initial trading contacts into a territorial empire by capturing key strategic positions that controlled major sea routes and commercial centres. Albuquerque's vision extended beyond simple commercial exploitation to the creation of a Portuguese-dominated trading network that would channel Asian wealth through Lisbon, while establishing permanent Portuguese settlements throughout the Indian Ocean. The foundation of Portuguese Asian strategy rested on the recognition that European military advantages, particularly superior naval artillery and disciplined infantry tactics, could compensate for the vast numerical superiority of Asian forces. Portuguese analysis of Indian Ocean politics revealed a fragmented landscape of competing Muslim and Hindu rulers whose mutual hostilities created opportunities for European intervention. By allying with some local rulers against others, and by controlling strategic maritime choke points, a relatively small Portuguese force could exercise influence far exceeding its numerical strength. Albuquerque's capture of Goa in 1510 established the administrative centre of Portuguese Asia and demonstrated the effectiveness of Portuguese military methods adapted to Indian conditions. The city, located on an easily defensible island connected to the mainland by narrow causeways, provided an ideal base for Portuguese operations while offering sufficient territory for a substantial settler population. Albuquerque encouraged Portuguese soldiers to marry local women, creating a mixed-race population with personal stakes in Portuguese success, while addressing the chronic shortage of European women in Portuguese settlements. This policy of intermarriage, extended throughout Portuguese Asia, created distinctive Eurasian communities that served as cultural intermediaries and administrative agents for Portuguese colonial rule. The conquest of Malacca in 1511 secured Portuguese control over the crucial strait connecting the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, effectively placing Portuguese customs officials at the gateway between Asian trading zones. Malacca's position at the intersection of monsoon wind patterns made it an unavoidable stopping point for merchants travelling between India and China, while its diverse population of Malay, Chinese, Indian, and Arab traders provided commercial networks extending throughout Southeast Asia. Portuguese control of Malacca enabled systematic taxation of Asian trade while providing intelligence about commercial opportunities and political developments throughout the region. The capture of Hormuz in 1515 completed Albuquerque's strategic triangle by securing Portuguese dominance over the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Hormuz controlled access to the valuable Persian and Mesopotamian markets, while serving as the terminus for overland routes connecting Asian trade with the Mediterranean. Portuguese control of this strategic position effectively eliminated the traditional routes through which Asian goods had reached European markets, forcing Asian merchants to deal with Portuguese officials or abandon European trade entirely. These territorial acquisitions provided the foundation for the Estado da India, the Portuguese administrative system that governed their Asian empire until the 18th century. Unlike the Spanish-American Empire, which emphasized territorial conquest and direct rule over large indigenous populations, the Portuguese Asian Empire functioned primarily as a commercial network, linking strategically located fortified bases. Portuguese officials exercised direct control over their fortified settlements and immediate surroundings, while relying on local rulers and commercial partners to facilitate trade throughout the broader region. The cultural encounter between Portuguese and Asian civilizations produced complex patterns of accommodation and resistance that varied significantly across different regions and social groups. In some areas, particularly where Portuguese military superiority was overwhelming, local rulers accepted tributary relationships that preserved their internal autonomy while acknowledging Portuguese supremacy in maritime affairs. Elsewhere, sophisticated Asian states successfully resisted Portuguese pressure, limiting European influence to specific trading concessions while maintaining political independence. Religious conversion efforts accompanied Portuguese commercial expansion, but achieved mixed results depending on local conditions and Portuguese administrative priorities. In regions where Portuguese control was secure and indigenous political structures were weak, Catholic missions achieved substantial conversions, particularly among lower caste populations who found Christian egalitarianism attractive compared to Hindu hierarchical restrictions. However, in areas where established religions enjoyed strong political support, Portuguese missionary efforts made little headway despite official encouragement and substantial resource investment. The Portuguese Asian Empire at its early 16th century peak represented an unprecedented achievement in maritime logistics and strategic coordination. Portuguese officials in Lisbon exercised administrative control over territories scattered from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, coordinating commercial policies, military deployments, and diplomatic initiatives across oceanic distances that required months to traverse. The regular arrival of annual fleets carrying Asian spices to European markets demonstrated Portuguese mastery of monsoon navigation and their ability to maintain supply lines extending halfway around the globe. However, the very extent of Portuguese commitments in Asia contained the seeds of future difficulties. The empire's scattered territories required constant reinforcement from Portugal's limited manpower reserves, while the distances involved made effective coordination increasingly difficult as the empire expanded. Portuguese success had attracted the attention of rival European powers, particularly the Dutch, whose superior financial resources and administrative efficiency would eventually challenge Portuguese dominance in Asian waters. By the opening decades of the 16th century, Lisbon had transformed from a provincial Atlantic port into Europe's spice capital, a metamorphosis so complete that the city's very air bore the aromatic testimony to Portuguese global dominance. The Rua Nova dos Mercadores, Lisbon's commercial heart, housed warehouses whose contents represented the accumulated wealth of continents: pepper from Malabar, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the distant Moluccas, and cloves from islands so remote that their very existence had been mythical to earlier European generations. The systematic organization of this trade through the Casa de India, Portugal's royal trading monopoly, demonstrated administrative sophistication that rivaled any contemporary European institution while generating revenues that transformed Portugal from a peripheral kingdom into a major European power. The Casa de India operated from imposing stone buildings along Lisbon's waterfront, where royal officials coordinated the most complex commercial enterprise of the early modern world. Each spring, as monsoon patterns permitted departure from Indian waters, Portuguese officials in Goa dispatched the annual India fleet, carrying the year's accumulated spice purchases toward Lisbon. These vessels, heavily armed and carefully convoyed, carried cargoes whose value often exceeded the annual revenues of major European kingdoms. Upon arrival in Lisbon, royal inspectors catalogued each ship's contents, while customs officials calculated the crown's share of profits according to complex formulas that reflected the varying costs and risks associated with different trading regions. The crown monopoly system that governed Portuguese spice imports represented a sophisticated fusion of royal control with private investment that maximised state revenues, while providing incentives for individual merchants and ship owners. The Portuguese government retained exclusive rights to purchase certain high-value spices directly from Asian producers, while licensing private merchants to engage in other branches of Asian trade. This system ensured royal control over the most profitable aspects of the spice trade, while distributing risks and costs among private investors who possessed the local knowledge and commercial relationships necessary for successful trading operations. Portuguese success in the spice trade rested fundamentally on their ability to purchase Asian products at source prices far below those available to traditional Mediterranean intermediaries. Previous European access to Asian spices had depended on complex networks of Muslim and Venetian merchants who added substantial markups at each stage of the lengthy overland journey, from Asian production centres to European markets. Portuguese ships sailing directly from Lisbon to Asian ports eliminated most of these intermediary costs while utilising superior naval forces to impose favourable terms on Asian suppliers. The transformation of European cuisine that accompanied Portuguese spice imports reflected the profound cultural impact of Asian contact on European society. Pepper, previously so valuable that it served as currency in some European regions, became sufficiently common that middle-class households could afford to use it regularly in food preparation. Cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves began appearing in European recipes with increasing frequency, while entirely new culinary traditions developed around Asian ingredients that had no precedent in traditional European cooking. Portuguese cookbooks of the period reveal the systematic incorporation of Asian flavours into European dining customs, creating hybrid culinary traditions that reflected Portugal's position as cultural intermediary between European and Asian civilizations. The transformation of Brazil from an accidentally discovered territory of uncertain value into Portugal's most important colonial possession occurred gradually throughout the 16th century, driven by the systematic adaptation of Atlantic island plantation techniques to South American conditions and the development of sugar cultivation as Brazil's primary export industry. This economic evolution required the creation of entirely new forms of colonial administration, labour organisation, and cultural accommodation that would influence Brazilian development for centuries, while demonstrating Portuguese flexibility in adapting to colonial conditions vastly different from their Asian experience. The captaincy system that governed early Brazilian colonization reflected Portuguese recognition that the territory's vast size and limited immediate commercial value required decentralized administration, utilizing private resources and initiative rather than direct royal investment and control. King João III divided the Brazilian coast into 15 captaincies, granting each to a donatario who received hereditary rights to settle and govern his territory in exchange for promoting colonization and defending Portuguese territorial claims against French and Spanish encroachment. This system distributed the costs and risks of colonization among private investors while maintaining royal sovereignty over the territory as a whole. The success of individual captaincies varied dramatically depending on the administrative capabilities of their donatarios, the geographic characteristics of their territories, and the relationships they established with indigenous populations. The captaincy of Pernambuco, granted to Duarte Coelho, became the most prosperous early Brazilian settlement through systematic sugar cultivation and relatively successful accommodation with local indigenous groups. Conversely, the captaincy of São Vicente, despite its excellent natural harbour, struggled with administrative difficulties and indigenous resistance that limited its early development. These variations demonstrated both the potential and limitations of decentralized colonization in territories where European settlers remained vastly outnumbered by indigenous populations. The introduction of sugar cultivation revolutionized Brazilian colonial development by providing an export crop capable of generating substantial profits in European markets while utilizing Brazil's favorable climate and available labor resources. Portuguese experience with sugar production in Madeira and São Tomé provided the technical knowledge necessary for establishing Brazilian plantations, while Brazilian conditions offered significant advantages over Atlantic island production. The territory's vast size enabled plantation expansion on a scale impossible in smaller Atlantic possessions, while indigenous labor initially provided workforce alternatives to the African slaves who had become essential for Atlantic island sugar production. The Engenho system that organized Brazilian sugar production represented a distinctive form of colonial social organization that combined elements of European feudalism with adaptations to tropical agricultural conditions and multiracial labor systems. Each Engenho functioned as a largely self-sufficient community centered on the sugar mill and plantation house, with the Senhor de Engenho exercising patriarchal authority over family members, employees, slaves, and free dependents who comprised the plantation population. This system created isolated centers of Portuguese culture scattered throughout the Brazilian countryside, connected to European markets through coastal ports, but largely autonomous in their internal organization and social relationships. The relationship between Portuguese colonists and indigenous populations evolved through complex patterns of cooperation, conflict, and cultural fusion that varied significantly across different regions and time periods. Jesuit missionaries, arriving in Brazil during the 1540s, attempted to protect indigenous communities from colonial exploitation while promoting Christian conversion and European cultural practices. The aldeias or mission villages established by Jesuit fathers created spaces where indigenous peoples could maintain community organization while adapting to Portuguese colonial rule, though these communities remained vulnerable to colonial pressure for land and labor. The gradual replacement of indigenous labor with African slaves transformed Brazilian social organization and cultural development throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries. The devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations reduced the availability of Indian labor, while Portuguese sugar plantation expansion increased labor demand beyond what surviving indigenous communities could supply. The importation of enslaved Africans provided planters with workers adapted to tropical agricultural conditions while creating new forms of cultural interaction between European, African, and indigenous traditions. Brazilian cities developed distinctive characteristics that reflected their role as intermediaries between plantation agriculture and European markets, while accommodating the complex racial and social hierarchies that characterized colonial society. Salvador, serving as colonial capital until 1763, combined Portuguese architectural traditions with adaptations to tropical climate and local materials, creating urban landscapes that expressed colonial cultural fusion. The city's upper districts housed Portuguese officials and wealthy planters, while lower areas near the harbour accommodated merchants, artisans, and the substantial free black and mixed-race populations that developed through manumission and interracial unions. The expansion of Portuguese settlement beyond the coastal captaincies occurred gradually through the activities of bandeirante, mixed expeditions of Portuguese colonists, indigenous allies, and African slaves who penetrated the Brazilian interior in search of gold, slaves, and new agricultural opportunities. These expeditions, originating primarily from the captaincy of São Vicente, extended Portuguese territorial claims far beyond the coastal settlements, while establishing contact with indigenous groups throughout the Brazilian plateau and Amazon basin. The bandeirante expeditions represented a distinctive form of colonial expansion that combined military conquest with commercial enterprise and cultural accommodation. The discovery of gold in the Brazilian interior during the late 17th century transformed colonial development by creating new centers of population and economic activity, while providing the Portuguese crown with revenues that revitalized the kingdom's European position. The gold mines of Minas Gerais attracted massive internal migration from coastal sugar regions and substantial new immigration from Portugal, creating boom towns whose rapid growth strained colonial administrative capabilities while generating unprecedented wealth. The city of Ouro Preto emerged as the centre of this mining region, developing architectural and artistic traditions that reflected the fusion of Portuguese Baroque style with local materials and African artistic influences. Brazilian colonial culture developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the complex interaction of Portuguese, African, and indigenous traditions within the framework of Catholic religious practice and Portuguese legal institutions. The prevalence of interracial unions created substantial mixed-race populations whose social position fell between that of white colonists and enslaved Africans, leading to elaborate social hierarchies based on racial ancestry, legal status, and economic position. These hierarchies, while maintaining Portuguese colonial dominance, created opportunities for social mobility through education, economic success, and cultural assimilation that distinguished Brazilian colonial society from more rigid racial systems elsewhere in the Americas. The Portuguese colonial administration gradually centralized control over Brazilian development through the establishment of royal government in Bahia during the mid-16th century and the creation of increasingly sophisticated bureaucratic institutions for managing colonial trade, taxation, and defense. The creation of the Relação da Bahia provided colonial legal institutions while the establishment of royal monopolies over certain forms of trade ensured crown revenues from Brazilian commerce. However, the vast size of Brazilian territory and the practical autonomy of individual plantations limited the effectiveness of royal control, creating patterns of local autonomy within formal imperial unity that would influence Brazilian political development for centuries. Portuguese involvement in the African slave trade represented both the foundation of their Atlantic empire and its most morally troubling legacy, creating commercial networks that connected 4 continents, while causing demographic catastrophe across vast regions of Africa. The systematic organization of slave trading as a central element of Portuguese colonial policy emerged gradually from early 15th century raids along the West African coast, evolving into institutionalized commerce that shaped African, American, and European development for over 4 centuries. Understanding this trade requires examining both its commercial logic within contemporary economic systems and its devastating human cost for the millions of Africans who became unwilling participants in Portuguese imperial expansion. The Portuguese approach to African colonization differed fundamentally from their strategies in Asia and America, reflecting both the specific challenges of African political and environmental conditions and the evolution of Portuguese imperial priorities throughout the early modern period. Unlike the territorial conquest that characterized their American possessions or the fortified trading posts that dominated their Asian presence, Portuguese African settlements typically remained confined to coastal enclaves, while Portuguese influence extended inland through commercial relationships with African political authorities who controlled territory and population centers. The establishment of Portuguese settlements in Angola beginning in the 1570s represented the most ambitious attempt at territorial colonization in sub-Saharan Africa, though even here Portuguese control remained limited to specific regions along the coast and major river valleys. The foundation of Luanda as a Portuguese administrative centre created a permanent base for slave trading operations, while providing a model for Portuguese-African interaction that combined elements of European colonialism with accommodation to existing African political structures. Portuguese officials in Luanda exercised direct authority over the immediate vicinity of their settlements, while relying on treaties and commercial agreements with African rulers to facilitate trade throughout the broader region. The commercial relationships that facilitated the slave trade reflected complex interactions between European demand, African political systems, and the specific geographical conditions that made slave trading profitable for all parties, except the enslaved individuals themselves. African rulers and merchants possessed essential advantages in conducting slave raids and managing captive populations before their sale to European buyers, while Portuguese traders provided manufactured goods, weapons, and transportation that enabled African partners to expand their slave-gathering operations. The profits available from this commerce created powerful incentives for both European and African participants to expand and systematize their involvement, despite growing awareness of its human cost. The Middle Passage that transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic represented one of history's most systematic forms of human brutalization, designed to maximize profits while minimizing costs regardless of human suffering. Portuguese slave ships designed specifically for human cargo packed enslaved individuals into spaces barely adequate for survival during voyages lasting several months, under conditions that routinely resulted in mortality rates exceeding 20%. The survivors who reached American destinations bore not only the physical trauma of oceanic transport, but also the psychological devastation of permanent separation from family, community, and familiar cultural environments. The integration of enslaved Africans into American colonial societies created new forms of cultural synthesis and social organization that reflected the resilience of African cultural traditions under conditions of extreme oppression. In Brazil, where enslaved Africans eventually comprised the majority of the colonial population, African religious practices, musical traditions, and culinary preferences influenced the development of distinctive Brazilian cultural forms that combined African, European, and indigenous elements. The preservation of African cultural elements within colonial slave societies demonstrated both the strength of African traditions and the adaptive capabilities of enslaved communities struggling to maintain human dignity under dehumanizing conditions. The economics of slavery in Portuguese territories revealed the systematic subordination of human welfare to commercial profit that characterized the Atlantic slave trade throughout its existence. Portuguese planters calculated the productive lifespan of enslaved workers according to purely economic criteria, often concluding that working individuals to death and replacing them with new purchases was more profitable than providing adequate nutrition, housing, and medical care necessary for long-term survival. These calculations reflected the availability of continuing slave imports from Africa, which made individual enslaved lives economically disposable within the plantation system. Resistance to slavery took numerous forms ranging from individual acts of defiance to organized rebellions that challenged the entire colonial system. In Brazil, quilombos communities of escaped slaves created alternative social organizations that preserved African cultural practices while adapting to American environmental conditions. The Quilombo of Palmares, which maintained independence for nearly a century, demonstrated both the possibility of successful resistance to slavery and the determination of Portuguese colonial authorities to prevent challenges to the slave system. These resistance movements, while ultimately unsuccessful in eliminating slavery, preserved African cultural traditions and created alternative models of social organization that influenced later Brazilian development. The Portuguese justification for slavery relied heavily on contemporary Christian theology and classical precedents that provided intellectual frameworks for understanding enslaved Africans as legitimate objects of commercial exploitation. Portuguese religious and legal authorities argue that slavery served Christian purposes by removing Africans from pagan societies and providing opportunities for conversion to Christianity, while classical precedent suggested that enslavement of war captives represented legitimate consequences of military defeat. These justifications, while sincerely believed by many contemporary Portuguese, served primarily to rationalize commercial practices whose profitability provided the fundamental motivation for their continuation. The development of Mozambique as a Portuguese colony followed patterns similar to those established in Angola, though the specific conditions of East African politics and geography created distinctive characteristics in Portuguese-African relationships. The Portuguese presence in Mozambique remained concentrated in coastal settlements and strategic river valley positions, while Portuguese influence inland operated through prazos grants of land and jurisdiction to Portuguese settlers who married into local African ruling families and exercised authority through hybrid Portuguese-African institutions. This system created unique forms of cultural fusion, while facilitating Portuguese participation in existing African commercial networks. The demographic impact of the slave trade on African societies represented one of history's most severe examples of externally imposed population loss, affecting social organization, economic development, and political stability throughout vast regions of the continent. Conservative estimates suggest that Portuguese territories in Africa lost several million people to the slave trade, while the broader disruption caused by slave raiding and warfare associated with slave gathering affected many more individuals who remained in Africa. These population losses occurred disproportionately among young adults, creating demographic imbalances that affected African societies for generations after the end of the slave trade. The cultural consequences of Portuguese involvement in Africa extended beyond the slave trade to include religious conversion, architectural influence, and linguistic change that created lasting connections between Portuguese and African societies. Portuguese missionaries, while often serving imperial rather than purely religious purposes, established educational institutions and promoted literacy in Portuguese among African converts. The creation of Portuguese-speaking African communities, particularly in urban areas, facilitated ongoing cultural exchange while providing African populations with access to wider networks of communication and commercial opportunity. The ultimate abolition of slavery in Portuguese territories occurred gradually throughout the 19th century, reflecting changing economic conditions, international pressure, and evolving moral sensibilities rather than sudden conversion to humanitarian principles. The process revealed both the depth of Portuguese economic dependence on slave labour and the practical difficulties of restructuring colonial societies that had developed around enslaved populations. The transition from slavery to other forms of labour exploitation demonstrated continuities in Portuguese colonial attitudes toward African populations that persisted long after formal emancipation. The succession crisis that engulfed Portugal following the death of King Sebastian at the Battle of Alquerçaquibir in 1578 transformed the kingdom's imperial trajectory in ways that would reverberate across continents for generations. Sebastian's death in the Moroccan desert, leading a quixotic crusade against Islamic forces, left Portugal without a direct heir and precipitated a dynastic struggle that would ultimately subordinate Portuguese imperial interest to Spanish strategic priorities for 60 years. The resolution of this crisis through Spanish military intervention and Philip II's assumption of the Portuguese crown created the Iberian Union, a political arrangement that subjected the world's most extensive maritime empire to the administrative control of its principal European rival. The immediate consequences of Spanish succession became apparent as Portuguese territories found themselves incorporated into a global conflict system that prioritized Spanish strategic interests over Portuguese commercial considerations. Philip II's inheritance of the Portuguese crown brought with it not merely a European kingdom, but an entire oceanic empire whose Asian spice trade, African slave networks, and Brazilian sugar plantations generated revenues that could support Spanish military ambitions across Europe and the Mediterranean. The integration of Portuguese colonial wealth into Spanish imperial finance provided Philip with resources to sustain the prolonged conflicts with France, England, and the Ottoman Empire that characterized late 16th century European politics. However, this incorporation also exposed Portuguese territories to attacks from Spain's enemies, who recognized that assaults on Portuguese possessions could damage Spanish interests while requiring fewer resources than direct attacks on Spanish territories in Europe or America. Dutch naval forces rebelling against Spanish rule in the Netherlands systematically targeted Portuguese settlements in Asia and Brazil, correctly calculating that Portuguese colonial wealth sustained Spanish military operations in Europe. The Dutch West India Company's conquest of Pernambuco and temporary occupation of northern Brazil between 1630 and 1654 demonstrated how Portuguese territories had become proxies in conflicts that served Spanish rather than Portuguese interests. The administrative integration of Portuguese territories into the Spanish imperial system created institutional tensions that reflected fundamental differences between Portuguese and Spanish approaches to colonial governance. The Portuguese Estado da India had evolved as a decentralized network of trading posts and strategic bases that relied heavily on local accommodation and commercial partnerships with Asian rulers. Spanish colonial administration, developed primarily in the Americas, emphasized more direct territorial control and systematic extraction of precious metals through centralized bureaucratic institutions. The attempt to impose Spanish administrative methods on Portuguese territories often disrupted existing commercial relationships while failing to generate the increased revenues that Spanish officials anticipated. Cultural and linguistic tensions accompanying political unification revealed the persistence of Portuguese national identity despite formal incorporation into the Spanish monarchy. Portuguese nobles, merchants, and colonial administrators maintained distinctive practices and loyalties that distinguished them from their Spanish counterparts, while Portuguese territories continued to operate according to legal and commercial traditions that differed significantly from Spanish colonial precedents. The preservation of Portuguese as the language of colonial administration and commerce in Portuguese territories created parallel administrative systems within the unified monarchy that complicated effective coordination while preserving the institutional foundations for eventual Portuguese independence. The impact of the Iberian Union on Portuguese Asian territories proved particularly devastating, as Dutch military superiority in European waters translated into systematic conquest of Portuguese positions throughout the Indian Ocean. The Dutch East India Company, possessing superior financial resources and more efficient administrative organization than the Portuguese Estado da India, systematically captured Portuguese settlements while establishing alternative commercial relationships with Asian suppliers. The loss of Ceylon, Malacca, and numerous trading posts along the Indian coast reduced Portuguese Asian presence to a few strategic positions, while transferring the most profitable aspects of the spice trade to Dutch control. Brazilian development during the Iberian Union revealed both the vulnerabilities and resilience of Portuguese colonial society under foreign political control. The Dutch occupation of Pernambuco, lasting nearly a quarter century, demonstrated that Portuguese colonial territories could be conquered by European rivals, but also showed that Portuguese colonial populations possessed sufficient military capability and political cohesion to resist foreign occupation successfully. The eventual Portuguese reconquest of Dutch Brazil, achieved primarily through local initiative rather than assistance from the Spanish crown, illustrated the maturation of Portuguese colonial society, while providing a model for resistance to foreign control that would influence later independence movements. The economic consequences of Spanish rule included both the diversion of Portuguese colonial wealth to support Spanish military ventures and the integration of Portuguese territories into broader Atlantic trading networks that connected Spanish America with Portuguese Africa and Brazil. The use of Portuguese slave trading networks to supply Spanish-American plantations created new commercial relationships that survived Portuguese independence, while the circulation of American silver through Portuguese territories enhanced colonial economic development even as it served primarily Spanish interests. These economic integrations demonstrated both the exploitation of Portuguese resources for Spanish purposes and the creation of intercolonial relationships that transcended political boundaries. Religious and cultural policies during the Iberian Union reflected Spanish attempts to impose greater uniformity on Portuguese territories, while Portuguese populations and colonial administrators resisted changes that threatened established practices and privileges. The Spanish Inquisition's extension into Portuguese territories created new forms of religious supervision and cultural control, while attempts to standardize educational and administrative practices according to Spanish models encountered resistance from Portuguese institutions that had developed distinctive traditions. The tension between imperial standardization and colonial autonomy that characterized the Iberian Union would persist as a fundamental challenge throughout the subsequent history of Portuguese colonial administration. The gradual deterioration of Spanish military and financial capacity during the early 17th century created opportunities for Portuguese independence movements that combined dynastic legitimacy with practical grievances about Spanish rule. The rebellion that began in 1640 under the leadership of the Duke of Braganza drew support from Portuguese nobles who had been marginalized under Spanish rule, and from merchants whose commercial interests had suffered from Spanish strategic priorities. The successful establishment of Portuguese independence under João IV demonstrated both the persistence of Portuguese national identity during 60 years of Spanish rule and the practical impossibility of maintaining effective control over reluctant populations across oceanic distances. The restoration of Portuguese independence in 1640 required not merely the expulsion of Spanish forces from Portuguese territory, but the reconstruction of imperial institutions that had been damaged or distorted during 60 years of Spanish administration. The new Braganza monarchy faced the complex task of reasserting Portuguese control over colonial territories that had developed autonomous characteristics during the Iberian Union, while rebuilding commercial and diplomatic relationships that had been subordinated to Spanish interests. This process of imperial reconstruction would occupy much of the 17th century, while establishing patterns of Portuguese colonial administration that would persist until the final dissolution of the Portuguese Empire in the 20th century. The Portuguese Restoration of 1640 initiated one of the most remarkable recoveries in early modern European history. As a small kingdom that had lost its independence for 60 years, successfully reclaimed not only its sovereignty, but also most of its global empire within a generation. The movement that placed João IV on the Portuguese throne drew its strength from a unique combination of aristocratic conspiracy, popular nationalism, and colonial determination that enabled Portugal to survive simultaneous warfare with Spain and the Dutch Republic while rebuilding imperial institutions that had atrophied during the Iberian Union. This achievement required extraordinary diplomatic skill, military innovation, and administrative reform that transformed Portuguese imperial governance while preserving the essential commercial relationships that sustained the kingdom's global presence. The immediate challenges facing the Braganza monarchy in 1640 appeared almost insurmountable to contemporary observers who recognized that Portuguese independence could survive only if the new regime could defend itself against Spanish reconquest, while reasserting control over colonial territories that had developed significant autonomy during 60 years of Iberian Union. Spain, despite its declining military capabilities, remained a formidable adversary whose American silver revenues and European territorial base provided resources that far exceeded Portuguese capabilities. Simultaneously, the Dutch Republic was approaching the height of its naval power, and had demonstrated consistent ability to capture Portuguese colonial positions throughout Asia and America during the previous decades. The diplomatic foundation of Portuguese survival rested on the kingdom's successful cultivation of alliances with France and England, both of whom recognized strategic advantages in supporting Portuguese independence against Spanish hegemony. The Franco-Portuguese alliance, formalized through the marriage of Catherine of Braganza to Charles II of England in 1662, provided Portugal with European allies whose enmity towards Spain created opportunities for Portuguese diplomatic and military cooperation against common adversaries. These alliances enabled Portugal to coordinate military pressure against Spain while receiving financial and material support that compensated for the kingdom's limited domestic resources. The military innovations that enabled Portuguese forces to resist Spanish reconquest while reclaiming colonial territories reflected both tactical adaptations to contemporary warfare and strategic recognition that Portugal's geographic position required defensive rather than offensive military postures. The construction of fortified positions along the Spanish frontier, designed according to the most advanced contemporary principles of military engineering, created defensive barriers that could be maintained with relatively small garrisons while imposing prohibitive costs on Spanish attempts at invasion. The development of Portuguese naval capabilities, including the construction of ships of the line capable of challenging Dutch and Spanish vessels in colonial waters, provided the maritime strength necessary for imperial reconquest. The reconquest of Brazil from Dutch occupation represented the most significant early achievement of Portuguese restoration. demonstrating both the military capabilities of Portuguese colonial populations and the strategic importance of American territories for Portuguese imperial survival. The campaigns that expelled Dutch forces from Pernambuco between 1645 and 1654 relied primarily on local Portuguese and Brazilian initiative rather than reinforcement from Europe, revealing the maturation of colonial society while establishing precedents for colonial self-defense that would influence later Brazilian development. The success of these campaigns provided the restored Portuguese monarchy with control over sugar revenues that were essential for financing continued resistance to Spanish pressure. Administrative reforms implemented during the Restoration period reflected Portuguese recognition that effective imperial governance required institutional innovations that addressed the specific challenges of governing territories scattered across multiple continents while maintaining coordination with limited communication capabilities. The creation of the Conselho Ultramarino in 1642 provided centralized oversight of colonial affairs while preserving sufficient local autonomy to enable effective decision-making in territories separated from Lisbon by months of oceanic travel. This administrative system balanced central control with colonial flexibility in ways that enabled Portuguese territories to function effectively, despite the communication delays that characterized early modern imperial governance. The economic restructuring that accompanied Portuguese restoration involved both the reconstruction of commercial relationships disrupted during the Iberian Union and the adaptation of Portuguese imperial strategy to new competitive conditions created by Dutch and English expansion into traditional Portuguese markets. The Portuguese crown's negotiation of new trading agreements with Asian rulers who had transferred their allegiance to Dutch competitors required diplomatic skill and commercial flexibility that demonstrated Portuguese capacity for imperial adaptation. The development of alternative markets for Portuguese colonial products, particularly in northern Europe where demand for Brazilian sugar and tobacco was expanding rapidly, provided revenues that sustained Portuguese independence while reducing dependence on traditional Mediterranean trading relationships. The cultural and religious policies of the Restoration period emphasized Portuguese distinctiveness from Spanish traditions while promoting imperial unity through shared Catholic identity and Portuguese linguistic culture. The promotion of Portuguese language and literature, particularly in colonial territories where Spanish influence had grown during the Iberian Union, served both nationalist and practical purposes by reinforcing communication networks that connected dispersed territories while asserting Portuguese cultural autonomy. The revival of Portuguese religious institutions, including the expansion of missionary activities in colonial territories, provided both spiritual and administrative frameworks for imperial integration, while distinguishing Portuguese colonial policies from Spanish precedents. The reconstruction of Portuguese Asian presence required careful negotiation with both European competitors and Asian political authorities who had adapted to Portuguese absence during the period of Dutch expansion. The retention of Goa, Macau, and Timor as Portuguese bases provided territorial foundations for continued Asian involvement, while the development of commercial relationships with Asian rulers who had maintained neutrality during Portuguese-Dutch conflicts created opportunities for economic recovery. The Portuguese recognition that their Asian empire could no longer compete directly with Dutch commercial supremacy led to strategic adaptations that emphasized diplomatic accommodation and commercial flexibility rather than territorial expansion. African colonial development during the Restoration period reflected Portuguese recognition that control over slave trading networks provided essential support for Brazilian plantation agriculture, while offering opportunities for territorial expansion that required minimal investment compared to Asian or American alternatives. The consolidation of Portuguese control over Angola through military campaigns against African rulers who had asserted independence during the Iberian Union demonstrated Portuguese capacity for imperial reconquest, while providing access to slave labor that sustained Brazilian economic development. The expansion of Portuguese influence in Mozambique created alternative sources of enslaved labor, while establishing territorial claims that would support later African colonization. The Restoration period's diplomatic achievements extended beyond European alliances to encompass commercial and political agreements with numerous American, Asian, and African partners whose cooperation was essential for Portuguese imperial reconstruction. The negotiation of trade agreements with English and French merchants who had developed interests in Portuguese colonial markets during the Iberian Union created commercial relationships that provided revenues while avoiding conflicts that could threaten Portuguese independence. The maintenance of tributary relationships with Asian rulers and African chiefs demonstrated Portuguese diplomatic flexibility while preserving the commercial networks that sustained imperial revenues. The long-term consequences of Portuguese restoration established patterns of imperial governance and international relations that would characterize Portuguese colonial policy until the 18th century. The successful defense of independence against Spanish pressure while reclaiming most colonial territories demonstrated Portuguese resilience while revealing the practical limitations that would constrain future imperial expansion. The diplomatic and military innovations developed during the Restoration period provided institutional foundations for Portuguese imperial administration while establishing precedents for colonial autonomy that would influence later Portuguese responses to independence movements. The Treaty of Methuen, signed between Portugal and England in 1703, represented one of the most consequential economic agreements in early modern European history, establishing patterns of commercial relationship that would fundamentally alter Portuguese imperial development while creating dependencies that persisted well into the modern era. Named after John Methuen, the English envoy who negotiated the agreement, this treaty ostensibly provided mutual commercial advantages to both signatories, but in practice created an economic relationship that subordinated Portuguese industrial development to English manufacturing interests, while channeling Brazilian wealth through Portuguese territory into English commercial networks. The treaty's long-term consequences would transform Portugal from an independent imperial power into what economists would later recognize as a classic example of peripheral dependence within an emerging global economic system. The immediate context of the Methuen Treaty reflected the complex diplomatic and economic pressures generated by the War of Spanish Succession, which had divided Europe into competing alliance systems, while creating opportunities for smaller powers to secure advantages through careful diplomatic positioning. Portugal's entry into the Grand Alliance against France and Spain required English military and financial support that came with expectations of commercial reciprocity, while English strategic interests demanded secure access to Portuguese ports and Brazilian markets that could compensate for Mediterranean trading opportunities disrupted by warfare. The negotiation process revealed both Portuguese weakness in relation to English economic power and English recognition that Portuguese cooperation was essential for broader strategic objectives in southern Europe and the Atlantic. The specific terms of the Methuen Treaty appeared to offer reciprocal advantages that would benefit both Portuguese and English commercial interests, while strengthening the political alliance between the two kingdoms. The agreement provided English woolen textiles with preferential access to Portuguese and Brazilian markets in exchange for Portuguese wine receiving reduced tariffs in English territory, an arrangement that ostensibly played to each nation's comparative advantages while expanding trade volumes beneficial to both parties. However, the treaty's implementation revealed fundamental asymmetries in the economic relationship that favoured English industrial development, while discouraging Portuguese manufacturing and creating structural dependencies that would constrain Portuguese economic policy for generations. The impact of preferential English textile imports on Portuguese domestic industry proved devastating to artisanal communities that had developed sophisticated manufacturing capabilities during the previous centuries of imperial expansion. Portuguese wool and silk production, which had supplied both domestic and colonial markets, could not compete with English factory-produced textiles, whose lower costs reflected both superior manufacturing techniques and the economies of scale available to English producers serving global markets. The consequent decline of Portuguese manufacturing eliminated sources of employment and technical expertise, while creating import dependencies that transferred increasing proportions of colonial revenues to English merchants and manufacturers. The preferential treatment accorded to Portuguese wine in English markets provided some compensation for Portuguese industrial decline, while reinforcing the kingdom's specialization in primary commodity production that characterized peripheral economies within emerging global trading systems. The expansion of Portuguese vineyard cultivation, particularly in the Douro region where port wine development created new forms of agricultural specialization, generated rural employment and export revenues that partially offset losses in manufacturing sectors. However, this agricultural specialization increased Portuguese vulnerability to fluctuations in English demand, while limiting economic diversification that might have provided alternative sources of national income and employment. The flow of Brazilian gold through Portuguese territory to English creditors and suppliers created one of the 18th century's most remarkable examples of imperial wealth, failing to generate corresponding domestic development in the colonizing power. The discovery of extensive gold deposits in Minas Gerais during the late 17th century had provided the Portuguese crown with revenues that exceeded the combined income of most European monarchies, yet the structural dependencies created by the Methuen Treaty ensured that much of this wealth was transferred to England in payment for manufactured goods and military support. Contemporary observers recognized this paradox, with Portuguese economists calculating that Brazilian gold was creating English prosperity while leaving Portugal increasingly dependent on foreign manufactured products. The administrative challenges created by the Methuen Treaty reflected broader problems of economic policy coordination in early modern empires where colonial territories developed economic interests that sometimes conflicted with metropolitan commercial strategies. Brazilian planters and merchants, whose prosperity depended on access to manufactured goods and export markets for agricultural products, generally supported trading arrangements that provided superior products at competitive prices, regardless of their impact on Portuguese domestic industry. Colonial interests in cheap manufactured imports and profitable agricultural exports aligned with English commercial preferences, while contradicting Portuguese efforts to develop domestic manufacturing capabilities that could compete with foreign alternatives. The cultural and intellectual consequences of Portuguese economic dependence included growing awareness among Portuguese thinkers of the kingdom's subordinate position within European commercial networks and increasing criticism of political and economic policies that had created this dependency. Portuguese economists and political writers of the mid-18th century, influenced by emerging theories of national economic development, began analyzing the structural problems created by excessive reliance on primary commodity exports and manufactured imports. These intellectual developments provided foundations for later reform efforts, while contributing to broader European discussions about the relationship between commerce, manufacturing, and national power. The regional variations in Portuguese responses to the Methuen Treaty revealed the complex ways in which global economic integration affected different sectors and territories within the Portuguese Empire. Northern Portugal, where textile manufacturing had been concentrated, experienced economic decline and population loss as artisanal communities lost employment opportunities, while the Douro wine region experienced expansion and prosperity through increased export production. Similarly, different Brazilian regions responded differently to preferential English imports, with sugar and tobacco producers generally benefiting from improved access to manufactured goods, while nascent Brazilian manufacturing suffered from English competition. The diplomatic implications of Portuguese economic dependence extended far beyond commercial policy to encompass fundamental questions about national sovereignty and imperial autonomy that would influence Portuguese international relations throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The kingdom's reliance on English markets for colonial exports and English suppliers for manufactured imports created political vulnerabilities that limited Portuguese diplomatic flexibility, while providing England with economic leverage that could be used to influence Portuguese policy decisions. These dependencies became particularly apparent during international crises, when Portuguese interests conflicted with English strategic priorities, forcing Portuguese policymakers to choose between national preferences and alliance obligations. The attempts at economic reform initiated by the Marquis of Pombal during the mid-18th century represented systematic efforts to address the structural problems created by the Methuen Treaty, while maintaining the English alliance that remained essential for Portuguese security. Pombal's industrial development policies, including the establishment of royal manufactories and the restriction of foreign imports, aimed to recreate Portuguese manufacturing capabilities while diversifying the kingdom's economic base beyond primary commodity production. However, these reform efforts encountered both English resistance and domestic opposition from interests that had adapted to existing trading patterns, demonstrating the difficulty of reversing economic dependencies once they had become embedded in institutional structures. The long-term legacy of the Methuen Treaty extended well beyond its formal termination to encompass fundamental patterns of Portuguese economic development that persisted into the modern era. The treaty's role in preventing Portuguese industrialization, while reinforcing primary commodity specialization, established precedents for economic relationships between developed and developing nations that would characterize global economic systems for centuries. The Portuguese experience provided one of the earliest examples of how apparently beneficial commercial agreements could create structural dependencies that limited national development while transferring wealth from peripheral to core economies within emerging global trading networks. The French invasion of Portugal in 1807 precipitated the most dramatic transformation in Portuguese imperial history since the initial expansion into the Atlantic, as the royal court's flight to Brazil reversed the traditional relationship between European metropolis and American colony, while demonstrating both the vulnerabilities and resilience of imperial institutions under unprecedented stress. Napoleon's continental system, designed to exclude British commerce from European markets, made Portuguese neutrality impossible, given the kingdom's economic dependence on English trade and political reliance on British protection against Spanish and French pressure. The Portuguese government's refusal to join the continental blockade against Britain resulted in French military occupation that would temporarily extinguish Portuguese independence, while paradoxically strengthening Portuguese imperial unity through the remarkable expedient of governing the empire from its largest colony. The decision by Prince Regent João to transfer the entire apparatus of royal government to Rio de Janeiro represented one of the most audacious political innovations in early modern European history, demonstrating both Portuguese determination to preserve imperial unity and the practical possibility of governing a global empire from non-European territory. The evacuation of Lisbon in November 1807, accomplished under British naval protection just hours before French forces occupied the city, transported not merely the royal family, but the entire institutional structure of Portuguese government, including courts, archives, treasury, and administrative personnel. This unprecedented migration created the anomalous situation of a European empire governed from American territory, reversing traditional colonial relationships while preserving Portuguese sovereignty during the period of French occupation. The establishment of Rio de Janeiro as the effective capital of the Portuguese Empire transformed Brazilian colonial society, while creating new patterns of imperial administration that would influence Portuguese colonial policy long after the court's eventual return to Europe. The presence of royal institutions in Brazil elevated the colony's political status, while providing opportunities for Brazilian participation in imperial governance that had been impossible under traditional colonial arrangements. The creation of new governmental departments, educational institutions, and cultural facilities in Rio de Janeiro established infrastructure that supported Brazilian development, while demonstrating the practical advantages that could result from closer integration between European and American components of the Portuguese imperial system. The economic consequences of governing the Portuguese Empire from Brazil included both the direct benefits of reduced administrative distances and the broader implications of reorienting imperial trade patterns around American rather than European commercial centers. The royal court's presence in Rio de Janeiro facilitated direct communication with other Portuguese territories throughout the Atlantic, while enabling more efficient coordination of colonial policies across the empire. The opening of Brazilian ports to international commerce, necessitated by separation from European markets during French occupation, created new trading relationships while demonstrating Brazilian capacity to function as an independent commercial centre rather than merely a source of raw materials for European processing. The military campaigns that eventually expelled French forces from Portuguese territory revealed both the strength of Portuguese popular resistance and the essential role of British military support in Portuguese liberation. The Portuguese people's spontaneous uprising against French occupation, beginning with the revolt in Porto in June 1808, demonstrated national unity that transcended social and regional divisions while providing foundations for guerrilla warfare that made French control increasingly costly and precarious. The arrival of British forces under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, provided Portuguese resistance with professional military leadership and regular supply lines that enabled sustained campaigns against French occupation forces while establishing precedents for Anglo-Portuguese military cooperation that would persist throughout the 19th century. The restoration of Portuguese independence in 1814 required not merely the expulsion of French forces, but the reconstruction of governmental institutions that had been disrupted by 6 years of foreign occupation and the unprecedented experience of imperial governance from American territory. The Portuguese court's decision to remain in Brazil until 1821 reflected both the practical advantages of American residence and the complex political negotiations required to re-establish effective governance in European territory that had developed autonomous characteristics during the occupation period. The eventual return of King John VI to Lisbon left Brazil under the governance of his son Pedro, an arrangement that preserved imperial unity while recognizing Brazilian claims to enhanced autonomy within the Portuguese imperial system. The constitutional revolution that erupted in Portugal in 1820 reflected both liberal political ideas absorbed during the Napoleonic period and specific grievances about royal policies that had subordinated Portuguese interests to Brazilian development during the period of American residence. The revolutionary government established in Lisbon demanded the king's return from Brazil, while insisting on constitutional limitations that would prevent future royal policies that subordinated European to colonial interests. The resulting constitutional monarchy represented Portuguese adaptation to liberal political principles, while attempting to restore traditional metropolitan supremacy over colonial territories that had gained enhanced status during the period of American governance. The liberal constitution promulgated in 1822 attempted to balance metropolitan Portuguese interests with colonial claims to representation and autonomy, but the document's emphasis on centralized control from Lisbon contradicted the precedents of colonial participation in imperial governance that had developed during the Brazilian period. The Constitution's provision for colonial representation in the Portuguese quarters acknowledged colonial political rights while maintaining Lisbon's supremacy in imperial policy decisions. However, the practical implementation of these arrangements proved impossible, given the distances involved in transatlantic communication and the autonomous political traditions that had developed in Brazil during the previous decades. The Brazilian independence movement that emerged in response to Portuguese attempts to restore traditional colonial relationships demonstrated both the irreversible changes created by the Napoleonic period and the practical impossibility of governing transcontinental empires according to 18th century precedents. The proclamation of Brazilian independence by Pedro I in 1822 represented not merely colonial rebellion against metropolitan control, but the logical conclusion of political developments initiated by the royal court's residents in America. The new Brazilian empire's retention of monarchical institutions and Portuguese cultural traditions illustrated the complex nature of this independence, which preserved many elements of imperial unity while establishing formal political separation. The international recognition of Brazilian independence required Portuguese diplomatic accommodation to new political realities while preserving commercial and cultural relationships that could sustain continued cooperation between the former metropolitan power and its largest former colony. The Portuguese government's eventual recognition of Brazilian independence in 1825, achieved through British diplomatic mediation, established precedents for negotiated colonial independence that preserved elements of imperial relationship while acknowledging colonial rights to political autonomy. The commercial agreements that accompanied political recognition maintained preferential trading relationships while adapting to new political circumstances that required diplomatic rather than administrative coordination. The domestic consequences of Brazilian independence for Portuguese society included both the economic disruption caused by separation from the empire's most valuable territory and the political challenges of adapting governmental institutions to reduce territorial scope and financial resources. The loss of Brazilian revenues forced substantial reductions in governmental expenditure, while eliminating sources of patronage that had sustained political stability during the previous centuries of imperial expansion. The return of colonial administrators, military personnel and settlers from Brazil created social tensions while providing Portuguese society with individuals whose American experience influenced subsequent Portuguese political and economic development. The reorientation of Portuguese imperial policy following Brazilian independence emphasized African territories that had previously served primarily as sources of slave labor for American plantations, but now required development as alternative sources of colonial wealth. The gradual transformation of Angola and Mozambique from slave-trading bases into territorial colonies reflected Portuguese recognition that African development offered the most promising opportunities for continued imperial expansion. This strategic reorientation established foundations for the intensive African colonization that would characterize Portuguese imperial policy during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The proclamation of Brazilian independence on September 7, 1822, represented not merely the loss of Portugal's largest colony, but a fundamental transformation of Portuguese imperial identity that forced the kingdom to reconceptualize its global role and strategic priorities for the first time in 4 centuries. The independence movement led by Dom Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne who chose Brazilian nationalism over imperial loyalty, demonstrated the irreversible changes that had occurred during the Napoleonic period when the Portuguese court's residence in Rio de Janeiro had elevated Brazil from colonial dependency to imperial centre. The Brazilian decision to reject Portuguese attempts to restore traditional colonial relationships revealed the maturation of a distinct Brazilian political identity that made continued imperial unity impossible under 18th century precedents. The immediate causes of Brazilian independence reflected complex interactions between liberal constitutional politics in Portugal, Brazilian elite aspirations for continued autonomy, and broader Latin American independence movements that provided both inspiration and practical support for Brazilian nationalism. The Portuguese Cortes demands that Brazil return to traditional colonial status, including the closure of Brazilian ports to direct international trade and the subordination of Brazilian institutions to Lisbon's control, contradicted the precedents of Brazilian political participation and economic autonomy that had developed during the previous decade. The Brazilian political elite's recognition that independence offered the only means of preserving their enhanced status within a monarchical framework created the conditions for a relatively conservative independence movement that preserved social hierarchies while establishing political autonomy. The dynastic crisis created by Dom Pedro's choice of Brazilian independence over Portuguese succession provided the independence movement with monarchical legitimacy that distinguished Brazilian independence from the republican revolutions that characterized most Spanish-American independence movements. Pedro's proclamation of himself as Emperor of Brazil preserved constitutional monarchy while establishing Brazilian claims to equal status with European powers, creating a unique form of post-colonial political organization that maintained European political traditions within American territory. This monarchical independence created diplomatic opportunities while avoiding the political instability that affected many republican independence movements in Latin America. The military campaigns that secured Brazilian independence revealed both the limited Portuguese capacity for reconquest and the effectiveness of Brazilian resistance, organized around imperial institutions that commanded broader popular support than Portuguese colonial administration could have achieved. The Brazilian navy, constructed around ships and personnel that had served the Portuguese Empire, established control over Brazilian coastal waters while preventing effective Portuguese military intervention. The regional wars that expelled remaining Portuguese forces from northern and southern Brazil demonstrated the development of Brazilian military capabilities that could sustain independence against European reconquest attempts. The international recognition of Brazilian independence required careful diplomatic negotiation that balanced Brazilian claims to sovereignty with Portuguese interests in preserving commercial relationships and dynastic connections that could mitigate the economic and political consequences of imperial separation. British diplomatic intervention proved crucial in mediating between Brazilian and Portuguese positions, with Britain recognizing that Brazilian independence served British commercial interests, while Portuguese acceptance of independence could prevent prolonged warfare that would disrupt Atlantic commerce. The Treaty of Rio de Janeiro in 1825, which secured Portuguese recognition of Brazilian independence, established precedents for negotiated decolonization while preserving elements of imperial relationship through commercial agreements and dynastic connections. The economic consequences of Brazilian independence for Portugal included both immediate revenue losses that required substantial adjustment in governmental expenditure and longer-term implications for Portuguese commercial development that forced reorientation toward alternative markets and colonial territories. Brazilian independence eliminated the largest source of Portuguese colonial revenues while ending privileged Portuguese access to Brazilian markets that had sustained metropolitan commercial development for 3 centuries. The necessity of developing alternative sources of colonial wealth focused Portuguese attention on African territories that offered possibilities for territorial expansion and resource development, but required substantial investment in colonial infrastructure and administration. The social and cultural impact of Brazilian independence on Portuguese society reflected the profound connections that had developed between European and American components of the Portuguese Empire during centuries of imperial integration. The return of Portuguese colonial administrators, military personnel, merchants and planters from Brazil created communities of Brazilian immigrants whose American experience influenced Portuguese political, economic and cultural development. These returnees brought capital, commercial connections and political ideas that contributed to Portuguese liberal movements, while maintaining cultural and economic ties with independent Brazil that persisted long after political separation. The political lessons drawn from Brazilian independence influenced Portuguese imperial policy toward remaining colonies while contributing to broader European debates about colonial administration and imperial relationships. Portuguese recognition that Brazilian independence had resulted from attempts to restore traditional colonial restrictions after a period of enhanced colonial autonomy suggested the dangers of reversing colonial political development once it had advanced beyond traditional subordination. The Brazilian precedent demonstrated both the possibility of negotiated independence that preserved commercial relationships and the importance of adapting imperial institutions to changing colonial conditions rather than attempting to maintain static administrative relationships. The development of Portuguese-Brazilian diplomatic relations following independence established patterns of post-colonial cooperation that preserved many elements of imperial relationship while acknowledging political equality between the former metropolis and its former colony. The commercial agreements negotiated between Portugal and Brazil maintained preferential trading relationships while adapting to new political circumstances that required diplomatic rather than administrative coordination. Cultural exchange programs, educational cooperation, and shared linguistic traditions created foundations for continued cooperation that demonstrated the possibility of transforming imperial relationships into international partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than colonial subordination. The impact of Brazilian independence on Portuguese African colonial policy reflected both the necessity of developing alternative sources of colonial wealth and the availability of new administrative methods that could be applied to territorial expansion in Africa. Portuguese administrators who had gained experience in Brazilian territorial colonization brought expertise in plantation agriculture, indigenous relations, and colonial administration that could be adapted to African conditions. The gradual transformation of Portuguese African presence from coastal trading posts to territorial colonies reflected both the lessons learned from Brazilian development and the recognition that African territorial expansion offered the most promising opportunities for continued Portuguese imperial expansion. The constitutional implications of Brazilian independence for Portuguese political development included both the immediate challenges of adapting monarchical institutions to reduce territorial scope and the longer-term questions about Portuguese national identity that independence raised. The loss of Brazil forced Portuguese political leaders to reconceptualize national purposes and strategic priorities while adapting governmental institutions to European rather than global imperial responsibilities. The constitutional monarchy established in the 1820s reflected both liberal political principles and the practical necessity of governing a smaller territorial base with reduced financial resources compared to the imperial monarchy of the previous period. The regional variations in Portuguese responses to Brazilian independence revealed different perspectives on imperial policy and national development that would influence Portuguese politics throughout the 19th century. Northern Portugal, whose textile industries had suffered from Brazilian competition, generally supported independence as offering opportunities for industrial development, while regions that had depended on colonial trade experienced economic difficulties that required governmental assistance and policy adaptation. These regional differences contributed to political conflicts about imperial policy and economic development that would persist throughout the constitutional monarchy period. The international implications of Portuguese acceptance of Brazilian independence established precedents for European colonial policy while demonstrating the possibility of negotiated decolonization that preserved commercial relationships and cultural connections. The Portuguese-Brazilian independence settlement provided a model for managing imperial dissolution that avoided the warfare and economic disruption that characterized many other independence movements while maintaining cooperative relationships between former imperial partners. This precedent would influence subsequent Portuguese responses to colonial independence movements, while contributing to broader international discussions about imperial relationships and decolonization processes. The European partition of Africa during the late 19th century presented Portugal with both unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion and existential threats to the survival of Portuguese colonial presence on the continent, as the kingdom's ancient African settlements found themselves surrounded by the vastly superior resources and ambitions of major European powers determined to secure continental territories proportionate to their industrial and military capabilities. Portugal's participation in the scramble for Africa required the mobilization of limited national resources for competitive territorial expansion, while adapting 18th century trading post-imperialism to 19th century standards of effective occupation and administrative control that challenged the very foundations of Portuguese colonial tradition in Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, convened to regulate European competition for African territory, created both opportunities and constraints for Portuguese imperial ambitions that reflected the kingdom's anomalous position as Europe's oldest colonial power, but simultaneously one of its weakest contemporary states. Portugal's historical claims to extensive African territories, based on 4 centuries of coastal settlement and commercial penetration, commanded international recognition that provided diplomatic foundations for territorial expansion far beyond what Portuguese resources could have achieved through conquest alone. However, the conference's principle of effective occupation required Portuguese demonstration of administrative control throughout claimed territories, a standard that challenged Portuguese capacity while providing legal justification for rival European powers to contest Portuguese territorial claims. The Portuguese response to Berlin Conference requirements involved the rapid expansion of colonial administration throughout the African interior, transforming centuries-old patterns of coastal trading posts and river valley settlements into comprehensive territorial control that extended Portuguese sovereignty across vast regions of Central and Southeastern Africa. The establishment of administrative posts throughout Angola and Mozambique required unprecedented investments in colonial infrastructure while demanding military capabilities that exceeded traditional Portuguese colonial resources. The recruitment of colonial administrators, military personnel and technical specialists for African service created new categories of imperial employment while straining Portuguese educational and professional institutions that lacked experience in territorial colonization on the scale required by 19th century imperial standards. The pink map that Portuguese cartographers presented to European audiences during the 1880s represented the most ambitious territorial claim in Portuguese imperial history, proposing Portuguese sovereignty over a continuous belt of African territory connecting Angola and Mozambique across the continental interior. This transcontinental vision reflected both Portuguese determination to secure a major role in African partition and recognition that Portuguese survival as an African colonial power required territorial expansion commensurate with contemporary European imperial standards. The Pink Map proposal challenged British strategic interests in connecting Cape Colony with Egypt while demonstrating Portuguese willingness to compete directly with major European powers for African territorial control. The British Ultimatum of 1890, demanding Portuguese withdrawal from territories claimed under the Pink Map, precipitated the most severe crisis in Anglo-Portuguese relations since the 17th century, while demonstrating the practical limitations of Portuguese imperial ambitions when confronted by superior British naval and diplomatic power. The ultimatum's demand that Portugal abandon territorial claims in the Zambezi Valley effectively terminated Portuguese transcontinental ambitions, while preserving British control over potential railway routes connecting Cape Colony with Egyptian territory. Portuguese compliance with British demands while preserving the alliance essential for national security created domestic political crisis that contributed to the eventual overthrow of the constitutional monarchy and the establishment of the republican regime. The actual Portuguese territorial consolidation that followed the Berlin Conference and the British ultimatum focused on the systematic occupation and administration of Angola and Mozambique as separate colonial territories whose development would justify Portuguese participation in African partition while providing economic return sufficient to sustain continued colonial investment. The campaigns of military conquest required to establish effective Portuguese control over the interior regions of both territories involved prolonged warfare against African rulers, whose resistance demonstrated both the military capabilities of indigenous forces and the costs of territorial colonization for European powers with limited resources. The Gunganhana Wars in Mozambique and the campaigns against African rulers in Angola revealed Portuguese military capabilities while establishing precedents for colonial administration that would characterize Portuguese African rule throughout the 20th century. The economic development strategies implemented in Portuguese Africa during the Scramble period reflected both Portuguese recognition of the need to generate colonial revenues sufficient to justify territorial expansion and the practical constraints imposed by limited metropolitan resources and international competition. The concession system that granted extensive territorial and economic rights to chartered companies provided mechanisms for colonial development that minimized direct governmental investment while attracting private capital from domestic and international sources. However, the concession system also created problems of governmental control while generating limited revenues compared to the territorial extent of Portuguese claims, demonstrating the challenges of profitable colonization in African territories that lacked obvious mineral wealth or favorable conditions for European agricultural settlement. The labor systems developed for Portuguese African colonies during this period established patterns of forced labor and administrative control that reflected both Portuguese colonial traditions and adaptations to 19th century economic requirements for systematic resource extraction. The various forms of compulsory labour implemented in Angola and Mozambique provided labour supplies for colonial economic development while creating administrative mechanisms for controlling African populations throughout Portuguese territorial claims. These labour systems, while economically functional from Portuguese perspectives, created forms of exploitation that would generate international criticism and African resistance throughout the 20th century, while establishing precedents for Portuguese colonial administration that would persist until decolonization. The cultural and educational policies implemented in Portuguese Africa during the Scramble period reflected Portuguese attempts to create colonial societies that combined effective administrative control with cultural assimilation that would justify Portuguese territorial claims through demonstration of civilizing achievements. The expansion of Catholic missionary activities, Portuguese language education, and European legal institutions provided mechanisms for cultural integration while creating colonial elites whose education and cultural formation supported Portuguese administrative objectives. However, these assimilation policies affected only small minorities of African populations, while creating tensions between assimilated elites and traditional authorities that would influence African political development throughout the colonial period. The international dimensions of Portuguese participation in the African partition included both cooperation with other European powers in establishing continental boundaries and competition for international recognition of Portuguese colonial achievements that would justify continued territorial control. The negotiation of territorial boundaries with British, German, and Belgian colonial authorities required diplomatic skills while establishing precedents for international cooperation in African affairs that would influence subsequent Portuguese colonial policy. The Portuguese emphasis on demonstrating effective occupation through administrative development and economic progress reflected recognition that international opinion would evaluate Portuguese colonial performance according to contemporary European standards rather than historical precedents. The resistance movements that emerged in response to Portuguese territorial expansion during the Scramble period revealed both African political capabilities and the limitations of Portuguese military and administrative control throughout claimed territories. The various forms of African resistance, ranging from diplomatic negotiation to armed rebellion, challenged Portuguese claims to effective occupation while demonstrating the continuing vitality of African political institutions despite European territorial partition. The Portuguese military responses to African resistance established patterns of colonial warfare and administrative control that would characterize Portuguese African rule while revealing the ongoing costs of maintaining European control over reluctant African populations. The long-term consequences of Portuguese participation in the Scramble for Africa established territorial foundations for 20th century Portuguese colonialism while creating administrative and economic commitments that would influence Portuguese domestic development for generations. The consolidation of Portuguese control over Angola and Mozambique created colonial territories whose size and population far exceeded Portuguese metropolitan dimensions, while requiring investments in colonial infrastructure and administration that strained national resources throughout the 20th century. The precedents of forced labour, administrative control, and cultural assimilation established during the Scramble period would persist as fundamental characteristics of Portuguese colonial policy until the final decolonization of Portuguese Africa in the 1970s. The Portuguese Republican Revolution of October 5, 1910, initiated the final chapter of Portuguese imperial history under circumstances that seemed to promise colonial renewal, but instead established patterns of intensified exploitation and administrative rigidity that would characterize the empire's declining decades. The Republican movement that overthrew King Manuel II drew much of its ideological inspiration from colonial grievances, particularly the humiliation of the British ultimatum of 1890 and the perceived weakness of monarchical responses to international pressure on Portuguese territorial claims. The new Republican regime promised to restore Portuguese imperial prestige through more effective colonial administration and economic development. Yet the practical implementation of Republican colonial policies revealed the fundamental constraints that limited Portuguese imperial capabilities regardless of constitutional arrangements or ideological commitments. The immediate colonial consequences of Republican revolution reflected both the regime's determination to demonstrate imperial competence and the practical limitations imposed by Portugal's precarious financial condition and limited administrative capabilities. The First Republic inherited colonial territories in Africa and Asia, whose administration required substantially greater resources than previous monarchical governments had invested, while facing international scrutiny that demanded evidence of effective occupation according to contemporary European standards. The Republican commitment to secular education, economic modernization, and administrative rationalization promised colonial improvements that would justify Portuguese territorial claims while generating revenue sufficient to sustain both metropolitan and imperial development. The colonial administrative reforms implemented during the early Republican period emphasized centralized control from Lisbon, combined with systematic economic exploitation designed to generate maximum returns from territorial possessions whose development had been neglected during the final monarchical decades. The creation of new colonial ministries and administrative departments reflected Republican recognition that effective imperial governance required institutional specialization beyond the capabilities of traditional governmental structures, while the recruitment of technically trained colonial administrators represented attempts to modernize Portuguese imperial capabilities according to contemporary European precedents. However, these administrative innovations occurred within financial constraints that limited their effectiveness, while creating bureaucratic complexity that often impeded rather than facilitated colonial development. The economic policies pursued by Republican colonial administrators reflected both contemporary theories of imperial development and specific Portuguese necessities for colonial revenues that could support metropolitan governmental expenditure during a period of chronic financial instability. The expansion of forced labor systems throughout Portuguese Africa represented Republican attempts to mobilize colonial populations for economic production, while minimizing the costs of voluntary wage labor that would have required substantial monetary investment. The various forms of compulsory cultivation, labor recruitment, and taxation implemented under Republican administration created mechanisms for systematic resource extraction that generated colonial revenues while imposing severe hardships on African populations whose welfare received minimal governmental attention. World War I provided Portuguese colonial territories with unexpected strategic importance, while demonstrating both the military capabilities and vulnerabilities of Portuguese imperial administration under wartime conditions. Germany's African territorial ambitions threatened Portuguese colonial boundaries, while German submarine warfare disrupted Atlantic communication between Lisbon and colonial territories, forcing Portuguese colonial administrators to exercise unprecedented autonomy in defending territorial integrity and maintaining governmental functions. The military campaigns in East Africa, where Portuguese and German colonial forces engaged in prolonged warfare across Mozambican territory, revealed both Portuguese military capabilities and the devastating impact of European warfare on African civilian populations. The wartime mobilization of colonial resources for European military purposes established precedents for systematic economic exploitation that would characterize Portuguese colonial policy throughout the 20th century, as colonial territories were required to contribute both human and material resources for metropolitan objectives regardless of colonial developmental needs. The recruitment of African soldiers for European military service, the requisition of colonial agricultural products for wartime supply, and the diversion of colonial revenues for military expenditure demonstrated the subordination of colonial welfare to metropolitan priorities that would persist as fundamental characteristics of Portuguese imperial administration. The wartime experience also revealed the practical autonomy that colonial territories could exercise during periods when metropolitan control was disrupted, providing precedents for colonial self-governance that would influence later independence movements. The post-war international environment created new pressures on Portuguese colonial administration as emerging principles of national self-determination and international oversight of colonial conditions challenged traditional European assumptions about imperial sovereignty and colonial exploitation. The League of Nations mandate system, while not directly affecting Portuguese territories, established international precedents for evaluating colonial administration according to standards of population welfare and developmental progress that exceeded traditional Portuguese colonial capabilities. Portuguese responses to these international pressures emphasized cultural assimilation and economic development programs designed to demonstrate civilizing achievements, while maintaining essential features of exploitative labor systems and authoritarian administrative control. The cultural policies implemented by Republican colonial administrators reflected secular educational philosophies that emphasized Portuguese linguistic and cultural assimilation, while attempting to modernize colonial societies according to contemporary European models of social organization and economic development. The expansion of Portuguese language education throughout colonial territories provided mechanisms for cultural integration while creating colonial elites whose European education and cultural formation supported Portuguese administrative objectives. However, Republican educational policies also created unintended consequences by providing colonial populations with intellectual tools for understanding European political concepts, including principles of national self-determination and democratic governance that would eventually challenge Portuguese colonial rule. The economic contradictions inherent in Republican colonial policy became increasingly apparent as the regime's developmental rhetoric conflicted with practical necessities for colonial revenue extraction that required maintaining exploitative labor systems and authoritarian administrative control. Republican promises of colonial modernization and economic development required investments in infrastructure, education, and administrative capabilities that exceeded Portuguese financial resources, while international competition for colonial markets limited opportunities for profitable colonial trade. The resulting gap between Republican colonial rhetoric and administrative reality created credibility problems that affected both metropolitan political support for colonial policies and colonial population responses to Portuguese governmental authority. The regional variations in Republican colonial administration reflected both the diverse characteristics of different colonial territories and the practical limitations of implementing uniform policies across territories separated by oceanic distances and characterized by vastly different political, economic, and cultural conditions. Angola's extensive territorial size and mineral resources created opportunities for systematic economic development, while requiring substantial investments in administrative infrastructure and military control, while Mozambique's strategic location and developed transportation networks provided different possibilities for colonial integration with South African economic systems. The smaller territories of Portuguese Guinea, Cape Verde, and São Tomé required different administrative approaches adapted to their specific geographical and demographic characteristics. The domestic Portuguese political instability that characterized the First Republic created additional challenges for colonial administration, as frequent governmental changes disrupted policy continuity while creating opportunities for colonial administrators to exercise increased autonomy in territorial governance. The 16 different governments that ruled Portugal between 1910 and 1926 often lacked sufficient tenure to develop coherent colonial policies, while political conflicts in Lisbon diverted attention and resources from colonial administration during periods when international competition for African territories was intensifying. This governmental instability contributed to the growth of colonial administrative autonomy that would complicate later attempts to implement centralized imperial policies under authoritarian rule. The military coup that ended the First Republic in 1926 occurred partly in response to colonial failures that had damaged Portuguese international prestige while failing to generate economic benefits sufficient to justify continued imperial investment. The Republican regime's inability to develop effective colonial policies that could satisfy both international expectations and domestic economic necessities contributed to broader political crises that enabled military intervention in Portuguese politics. The military government's promises of colonial reform and imperial renewal reflected continuing Portuguese commitment to imperial ambitions, while acknowledging the fundamental inadequacies of previous Republican colonial administration. The formation of liberation movements in Angola, Malay, FNLA UNITA, Mozambique, Frelimo, and Portuguese Guinea, PAG, during the early 1960s represented the emergence of African nationalist organizations whose military and political capabilities exceeded Portuguese expectations, while enjoying support from socialist countries and the Organization of African Unity that provided weapons, training and diplomatic assistance for independence struggles. The Portuguese military response to African independence movements evolved from initial confidence in rapid victory to recognition that the colonial wars represented existential struggles for Portuguese imperial survival that would require unprecedented military investment and international support to sustain indefinitely. The deployment of increasing numbers of Portuguese conscript soldiers to African territories, reaching over 150,000 troops by the early 1970s, demonstrated both Portuguese determination to maintain colonial control and the escalating costs of military resistance to African independence. The development of counterinsurgency strategies adapted to African geographical conditions revealed Portuguese military learning, while indicating the practical impossibility of achieving decisive victory against independence movements that enjoyed popular support and external assistance. The international isolation that accompanied Portuguese colonial wars reflected both changing global attitudes toward colonialism and specific Portuguese policies that violated emerging international standards for colonial administration and human rights. The United Nations condemnation of Portuguese colonial policies, combined with arms embargoes and diplomatic sanctions imposed by various countries, demonstrated international consensus that Portuguese colonial rule had become anachronistic and illegitimate. The Estado Novo regime's responses to international pressure emphasized Portuguese historical rights to African territories, while claiming that liberation movements represented communist subversion rather than legitimate expressions of African national aspirations. The domestic Portuguese consequences of the colonial wars included both the enormous financial costs that diverted resources from domestic development and the social trauma experienced by Portuguese families whose sons served in prolonged African campaigns, characterized by brutal warfare and uncertain objectives. The annual draft of Portuguese youth for African military service created widespread popular opposition to colonial policies while generating political consciousness that would eventually contribute to the regime's overthrow. The returning colonial veterans brought experiences of African warfare that included both exposure to independence, movement arguments, and disillusionment with Portuguese colonial justifications, creating domestic opposition to continued colonial wars that transcended traditional political boundaries. The economic burden of sustaining colonial wars while maintaining domestic authoritarian control required Estado Novo authorities to seek international financial assistance and foreign investment that compromised Portuguese sovereignty, while failing to generate sufficient resources for military victory in Africa. The regime's dependence on NATO military equipment and training created tensions with alliance partners who opposed Portuguese colonial policies, while Portuguese economic relationships with South Africa and Rhodesia associated Portugal with international pariah regimes that were themselves under international pressure for racial policies. These international complications demonstrated the impossibility of sustaining colonial wars without broader international support that Portuguese policies had made unavailable. The cultural and ideological responses of Estado Novo authorities to African independence movements emphasized Portuguese historical achievements and civilizing missions that justified permanent Portuguese presence in African territories, regardless of African popular preferences or international opinion. The regime's propaganda portrayed liberation movements as terrorist organizations manipulated by international communism, while claiming that Portuguese rule represented protection for African populations against chaos and communist exploitation that would inevitably follow independence. This propaganda, while effective for domestic Portuguese audiences, failed to convince international opinion or African populations whose direct experience contradicted Portuguese claims about beneficial colonial rule. The military strategies developed by liberation movements demonstrated both sophisticated understanding of international political conditions and effective adaptation of guerrilla warfare techniques to African geographical and social conditions. The coordination between different liberation movements, particularly in sharing training facilities and coordinating diplomatic initiatives, created regional networks of anti-colonial resistance that exceeded Portuguese capabilities to suppress through military means alone. The liberation movement's emphasis on political education and social development in areas under their control demonstrated alternative models of African governance that challenged Portuguese claims about African incapacity for self-rule. The Portuguese recognition that colonial wars could not be won militarily without international support that was unavailable led to increasing regime reliance on authoritarian control within Portugal, while seeking diplomatic solutions that could preserve Portuguese economic interests in Africa, even if political control had to be abandoned. However, the Estado Novo's ideological commitment to permanent colonial integration made negotiated independence politically impossible, creating contradictions that could only be resolved through regime change in Portugal itself. The growing awareness among Portuguese military officers that colonial wars were both unwinnable and economically ruinous contributed to the military coup planning that would eventually overthrow the Estado Novo regime. The regional variations in colonial war intensity and liberation movement success reflected both different geographical conditions and varying levels of Portuguese administrative and military control in different territories. The war in Portuguese Guinea, where PEG achieved the greatest success in establishing liberated zones and international recognition, demonstrated the possibility of successful independence struggle against Portuguese rule. The more complex situations in Angola and Mozambique, where multiple liberation movements competed for leadership while fighting Portuguese forces, revealed both the diversity of African nationalist movements and the challenges of achieving unity in independence struggles. The Carnation Revolution of April 25, 1974, precipitated the most rapid and comprehensive decolonization in modern imperial history, as the Portuguese military coup that overthrew Salazar's Estado Novo immediately abandoned the colonial wars and initiated negotiations for independence that would eliminate the Portuguese Empire within 2 years. The Armed Forces Movement, MFA, that orchestrated the revolution drew its primary motivation from the futility and human cost of the African colonial wars, which had consumed Portuguese lives and resources for over a decade, while failing to achieve military victory or international legitimacy for Portuguese colonial rule. The revolution's immediate commitment to African decolonization reflected both practical recognition that the colonial wars were unwinnable and ideological rejection of authoritarian policies that had sustained Portuguese imperial ambitions at enormous cost to both Portuguese and African populations. The revolutionary program announced by the MFA emphasized democratization, decolonization, and development as the 3 fundamental objectives that would guide Portugal's transition from authoritarian empire to democratic European nation, establishing explicit connections between domestic political liberation and colonial independence that rejected the Estado Novo's attempts to separate metropolitan and imperial politics. The Junta de Salvação Nacional that assumed power immediately following the coup announced Portugal's commitment to recognize the right of colonial populations to self-determination and independence, reversing 4 decades of Estado Novo doctrine that had declared Portuguese territories to be integral components of the Portuguese nation. This ideological transformation occurred virtually overnight, demonstrating both the artificiality of previous imperial justifications and the depth of Portuguese military and political exhaustion with colonial warfare. The practical implementation of decolonization required complex negotiations with liberation movements that had been fighting Portuguese rule for over a decade, while managing the enormous logistical challenges of withdrawing Portuguese military forces, colonial administrators, and settler populations from territories where Portuguese presence had been established for centuries. The Portuguese government's recognition of liberation movements as legitimate representatives of African populations reversed previous characterizations of independence fighters as terrorists, while creating the diplomatic foundation for negotiated transitions to independence. However, the speed of Portuguese political transformation created challenges for both Portuguese and African negotiators, who had to address complex issues of territorial boundaries, economic relationships, and population transfers within timeframes that allowed insufficient preparation for the practical challenges of independence. The Alva Agreement of January 1975, which established the framework for Angolan independence, exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of negotiated decolonization as Portuguese authorities attempted to transfer power to a coalition government representing the three major liberation movements, MPLA, FNLA, UNITA, that had fought both Portuguese forces and each other during the independence struggle. The agreement's provisions for a transition government, constituent assembly elections, and gradual Portuguese military withdrawal represented sophisticated attempts to create institutional frameworks for peaceful independence while avoiding the civil warfare that had characterized decolonization in other African territories. However, the fundamental incompatibilities between liberation movements that had developed different ideological orientations and foreign support networks made sustainable coalition government impossible, leading to civil war that persisted for decades after Portuguese withdrawal. The independence of Mozambique in June 1975 under Frelimo leadership demonstrated the possibility of relatively smooth decolonization when a single liberation movement possessed sufficient unity and popular support to assume governmental authority without prolonged internal conflict. Frelimo's Marxist-Leninist ideology and commitment to rapid social transformation created challenges for Portuguese economic interests and settler populations, but the movement's administrative capabilities and international support enabled effective governance during the transition period. The Portuguese-Mozambican relationship during decolonization established precedents for maintaining economic cooperation and cultural connections despite radical political changes, demonstrating possibilities for post-colonial relationships that transcended the immediate trauma of imperial collapse. The independence of Portuguese Guinea as Guinea-Bissau in September 1974 represented the culmination of Africa's most successful liberation struggle against Portuguese rule, as PEC had already established effective control over large portions of the territory while achieving international recognition for its provisional government before Portuguese decolonization began. The Portuguese recognition of Guinea-Bissau's independence formalized political realities that PEC had created through military victory and diplomatic achievement, providing a model for liberation movement success that influenced independence processes throughout Portuguese Africa. The relative ease of Portuguese withdrawal from Guinea-Bissau reflected both PAIGC's administrative competence and the territory's smaller Portuguese settler population compared to Angola and Mozambique. The massive population movements that accompanied Portuguese decolonization created one of the largest refugee crises in post-war European history, as approximately 1 million Portuguese colonists, colonial administrators, and African supporters of Portuguese rule fled to Portugal during the independence transitions of 1974 and 1976. The retornados, as these refugees came to be known, represented nearly 10% of Portugal's metropolitan population, and included individuals whose families had lived in African territories for generations, alongside recent immigrants who had sought opportunities in colonial territories during the Estado Novo period. The integration of these refugee populations into Portuguese society required substantial governmental resources while creating social tensions that affected Portuguese domestic politics for decades after decolonization. The economic consequences of rapid decolonization included both immediate disruption of Portuguese commercial relationships with former colonies and longer-term challenges of adapting Portuguese economic structures to European rather than imperial markets. The loss of protected colonial markets for Portuguese manufactured goods and privileged access to colonial raw materials forced fundamental restructuring of Portuguese industrial and agricultural production, while eliminating sources of foreign exchange that had supported Portuguese balance of payments. However, decolonization also released Portuguese resources and attention from colonial commitments that had drained national capabilities while preventing effective participation in European economic integration. The special case of East Timor demonstrated both the tragic consequences of hasty decolonization and the limitations of Portuguese capabilities to protect colonial populations during independence transitions complicated by regional power conflicts. Portugal's withdrawal from East Timor in 1975 occurred amid civil war between Timorese political movements, while Indonesian forces prepared for invasion that would result in decades of brutal occupation and population displacement. The Portuguese inability to prevent Indonesian occupation of East Timor reflected both the limitations of Portuguese military capabilities and the international community's unwillingness to support Portuguese efforts to ensure Timorese self-determination in the face of Indonesian regional ambitions. The international dimensions of Portuguese decolonization reflected both global support for African independence and great power interests in influencing the political orientation of newly independent Portuguese territories. The involvement of Cuban, South African, and Soviet forces in Angolan civil war demonstrated how Portuguese decolonization became entangled with Cold War conflicts that extended far beyond Portuguese-African relationships, while creating regional instabilities that persisted long after Portuguese withdrawal. The international community's generally positive response to Portuguese decolonization contrasted sharply with previous international isolation of Portuguese colonial policies, reflecting both approval for Portuguese democratic transition and recognition that rapid decolonization served broader international interests in ending African colonial wars. The cultural and linguistic legacies of Portuguese empire persisted through decolonization, as Portuguese language, educational institutions, and cultural practices continued to influence former Portuguese territories, despite political independence and ideological transformation. The creation of the Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, in 1996 provided institutional frameworks for maintaining cultural and economic relationships between Portugal and former colonies while respecting political independence and sovereignty. These post-colonial relationships demonstrated possibilities for transforming imperial connections into cooperative partnerships based on shared cultural heritage rather than political subordination. The domestic Portuguese responses to decolonization revealed complex attitudes toward imperial loss that combined relief at ending costly colonial wars with nostalgia for imperial grandeur and concern about national identity in post-imperial circumstances. The Portuguese democratic transition benefited from the elimination of colonial commitments that had sustained authoritarian rule while requiring fundamental reconceptualization of national purposes and international relationships. The successful integration of Portugal into European institutions following decolonization demonstrated both the possibility of transforming imperial powers into democratic European nations and the advantages of abandoning imperial commitments that had become economically and politically unsustainable. The evaluation of Portuguese decolonization from historical perspective reveals both remarkable achievements in ending colonial wars and transferring power to African governments, and tragic failures to prevent post-independence conflicts that caused enormous human suffering in several former Portuguese territories. The rapid pace of Portuguese decolonization, while necessary given Portuguese domestic political circumstances, created challenges for newly independent governments that lacked sufficient time to develop institutional capabilities and resolve internal conflicts before assuming full governmental responsibilities. The long-term consequences of Portuguese decolonization continue to influence political, economic, and cultural relationships throughout the Portuguese-speaking world, while providing lessons about both the possibilities and limitations of negotiated transitions from colonial rule to independence. The dissolution of the Portuguese Empire in 1975 marked not the end of Portuguese global influence, but rather its transformation from political control to cultural presence, as the Portuguese language emerged from imperial fragmentation to become one of the world's most widely spoken tongues, carrying with it architectural traditions, religious practices, culinary customs, and intellectual frameworks that continue to shape daily life across 4 continents. Today, over 260 million people speak Portuguese as their primary language, making it the 6th most spoken language globally and the fastest growing European language in the world. A remarkable achievement for a nation whose metropolitan population never exceeded 10 million during the height of its imperial expansion. This linguistic diaspora represents perhaps the most enduring legacy of Portuguese imperial ambition, creating communities of shared communication that transcend national boundaries while preserving cultural connections that political independence could not entirely sever. The evolution of Portuguese from a regional Iberian dialect to a global language occurred through the same processes of imperial expansion that carried Portuguese traders, administrators, and settlers to distant shores. But the language's survival and growth in post-colonial contexts reflects adaptations and innovations that have enriched Portuguese vocabulary and expression far beyond its European origins. Brazilian Portuguese, spoken by over 200 million people, has become the dominant variant of the language while incorporating indigenous American and African linguistic elements that reflect the complex cultural synthesis that characterized Portuguese colonial society in the Americas. The Lusophone African nations Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau and São Tomé and Príncipe have maintained Portuguese as official languages while developing distinctive national variants that incorporate local linguistic traditions and address contemporary African political and social realities. The architectural legacy of Portuguese expansion created distinctive building styles that combined European construction techniques with adaptations to tropical climates and local materials, producing hybrid architectural traditions that remain visible today in cities from Macau to Salvador, from Goa to Luanda. The Portuguese colonial Baroque that flourished in Brazil during the 18th century represents one of the most sophisticated architectural achievements of the colonial period, combining European decorative traditions with American gold wealth and African artistic skills to create monuments like the churches of Ouro Preto that rank among the world's great architectural treasures. The Manuelin style that developed in Portugal during the early 16th century, with its maritime decorative motifs celebrating Portuguese navigational achievements, influenced colonial architecture throughout the empire, while inspiring modern architects who seek to express Portuguese cultural identity through building design. Religious syncretism represents another fundamental aspect of Portuguese cultural influence, as Catholic missionary activities throughout the empire created distinctive forms of Christian practice that incorporated local religious traditions while maintaining connections to universal Catholic doctrines and practices. The popular Catholicism that developed in Portuguese colonial territories often blended Christian saints with indigenous deities or African spiritual figures, creating religious expressions that satisfied both missionary requirements for Christian conversion and popular needs for familiar spiritual practices. Culinary traditions represent perhaps the most intimate aspect of Portuguese cultural influence, as cooking techniques, spice combinations, and food preferences developed during the imperial period continue to shape daily eating habits throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. The global circulation of crops and cooking methods that accompanied Portuguese expansion created new culinary traditions that combined European, African, American, and Asian ingredients in ways that transformed eating practices across multiple continents. The use of chili peppers in African cuisine, the incorporation of American crops like cassava and sweet potatoes into African agriculture, and the development of distinctively Portuguese Asian dishes like Macanese cuisine demonstrate the complex cultural exchanges that occurred through commercial and colonial relationships. Musical traditions that emerged from Portuguese colonial encounters have achieved global recognition while preserving distinctive cultural characteristics that reflect the complex interactions between European, African, and American musical traditions. Brazilian samba and bossa nova, Cape Verdean morna, and Angolan semba represent musical forms that originated from Portuguese colonial cultural synthesis while achieving international popularity that has spread Portuguese musical influences far beyond Portuguese-speaking communities. The fado tradition that developed in Portugal itself incorporated musical elements from colonial territories, while expressing Portuguese national identity through distinctive vocal and instrumental techniques that have been recognized by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Literary and intellectual traditions that develop throughout the Portuguese-speaking world have created rich cultural exchanges that continue to influence contemporary thought and artistic expression. The emergence of major literary figures like Brazil's Machado de Assis, Angola's José Eduardo Agualusa, and Mozambique's Mia Couto demonstrates the vitality of Portuguese language literature, while revealing diverse cultural perspectives that reflect different historical experiences and contemporary challenges. The annual Camões Prize, awarded to outstanding Portuguese language writers regardless of nationality, provides institutional recognition for literary achievements that maintain Portuguese cultural connections while celebrating linguistic diversity and creativity. Educational and academic institutions throughout the Portuguese-speaking world continue to maintain relationships that facilitate cultural exchange and intellectual cooperation, despite political independence and different economic systems. The University of Coimbra's historical relationships with academic institutions in former Portuguese territories, the establishment of Portuguese language and culture centres in various countries, and the development of student exchange programs demonstrate institutional frameworks for maintaining cultural connections that transcend political boundaries while respecting national sovereignty and cultural autonomy. The contemporary challenge of preserving Portuguese cultural influence while respecting the cultural autonomy and national identity of formerly Portuguese territories requires diplomatic sensitivity and cultural humility that acknowledges both the positive and negative aspects of imperial legacy. The Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, established in 1996, provides institutional frameworks for cultural cooperation while avoiding the paternalistic attitudes that characterize colonial relationships. The success of these post-colonial cultural relationships demonstrates possibilities for transforming imperial legacies into cooperative partnerships that benefit all participants while preserving distinctive cultural traditions that enrich global cultural diversity. The economic legacy of Portuguese imperial expansion continues to influence contemporary global trade patterns, demographic distributions, and development strategies throughout regions that experience centuries of Portuguese commercial and political control, creating enduring structural relationships that shape economic opportunities and constraints for both Portugal and its former territories long after the formal end of imperial rule. The integration of diverse global regions into Portuguese commercial networks during the imperial period established precedents for economic relationships that persist in modified forms, while the demographic consequences of Portuguese expansion, including voluntary migration, forced labour transfers, and cultural mixing created population distributions and cultural characteristics that continue to influence social development and political relationships throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. Contemporary Portugal's economic development reveals both the lingering benefits and constraints inherited from imperial expansion, as the country's integration into the European Union required fundamental restructuring of economic relationships that had been shaped by centuries of imperial commerce and colonial resource extraction. The loss of protected colonial markets for Portuguese manufactured goods during decolonization forced Portuguese industry to compete in European markets while adapting production methods and quality standards to more demanding commercial environments. However, cultural and linguistic connections with former colonies have created opportunities for Portuguese businesses to maintain commercial relationships and develop new markets in rapidly growing economies like Brazil and Angola, demonstrating possibilities for transforming imperial legacies into mutually beneficial economic partnerships. The demographic legacy of Portuguese expansion includes both the global diaspora of Portuguese-descended populations and the complex ethnic compositions of societies throughout the former Portuguese Empire, creating social characteristics that continue to influence political development and cultural identity in numerous countries. Brazil's position as the world's largest Portuguese-speaking nation reflects both the scale of Portuguese colonial settlement and the demographic impact of African slavery and indigenous population decline during the colonial period. The ethnic diversity that characterizes Brazilian society, combining European, African, and indigenous elements in proportions that vary significantly across different regions, demonstrates both the extent of cultural mixing that occurred under Portuguese rule and the persistent social inequalities that reflect colonial hierarchies and exploitation patterns. The African societies that experience Portuguese colonial rule continue to address economic and social challenges that originated during the imperial period, including the demographic disruptions caused by the slave trade, the economic distortions created by colonial resource extraction, and the political legacies of authoritarian administration that limited indigenous institutional development. Angola's emergence as one of Africa's major oil-producing nations has created both opportunities for rapid economic development and challenges related to resource management and social equity that reflect broader patterns of post-colonial development throughout Africa. The persistence of Portuguese as the official language in Lusophone African countries has facilitated international communication and cooperation, while sometimes creating tensions with indigenous languages and cultural traditions that were marginalized during the colonial period. The Indian Ocean region that experienced Portuguese commercial and territorial control during the early imperial period retains architectural, cultural, and commercial legacies that influence contemporary tourism, trade relationships, and cultural identity. Goa's status as a major tourist destination reflects both the preservation of Portuguese colonial architecture and the development of distinctive cultural traditions that combined Portuguese, Indian, and other influences during centuries of imperial interaction. The small Portuguese territory of Macau, which reverted to Chinese sovereignty in 1999 as the last remnant of the Portuguese Empire, demonstrates both the persistence of Portuguese cultural influences under different political systems and the possibilities for maintaining cultural autonomy within larger political frameworks. The global circulation of crops, animals, and agricultural techniques that accompanied Portuguese expansion created ecological and economic changes that continue to influence contemporary agricultural production and food security throughout regions that experience Portuguese commercial penetration. The introduction of American crops like maize, cassava, and sweet potatoes into African agriculture contributed to population growth and dietary diversification that supported larger populations while creating dependencies on crops that originated in different continental environments. Similarly, the transfer of Asian spices and fruits to American territories and the introduction of African agricultural techniques into Brazilian plantation agriculture created agricultural systems that combined elements from multiple continents while adapting to specific local environmental conditions. The financial networks that developed during the Portuguese imperial period established precedents for international commercial relationships that influence contemporary global finance and trade. The circulation of Brazilian gold through Portuguese territory to international markets during the 18th century demonstrated both Portugal's integration into global financial systems and the country's peripheral position within those systems, as imperial wealth generated limited domestic industrial development while supporting more advanced economies in Northern Europe. Contemporary Portugal's experience with international debt management and European Union integration reflects similar patterns of peripheral dependence within global economic systems. Though democratic governance and European institutional membership provide political frameworks for addressing economic challenges that were unavailable during the imperial period, the social consequences of Portuguese imperial expansion include the creation of distinctive cultural identities and social hierarchies that continue to influence political development and social relationships throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. The concept of mestiçagem, or racial mixing, that characterized Portuguese colonial societies created complex social hierarchies based on racial ancestry, cultural assimilation, and economic status that differed from the more rigid racial categories that developed in some other colonial contexts. However, these hierarchies also perpetuated inequalities and discrimination that persist in contemporary Portuguese-speaking societies, requiring ongoing efforts to address historical injustices while building more equitable social relationships. The institutional legacies of Portuguese imperial administration continue to influence governmental structures and legal systems throughout former Portuguese territories, though post-independence political development has modified colonial institutions according to contemporary political principles and local conditions. The civil law legal systems that Portugal established throughout its territories provided foundations for post-independence legal development, while requiring adaptation to indigenous legal traditions and contemporary international legal standards. The challenge of building effective governmental institutions in post-colonial contexts has required balancing Portuguese administrative precedents with indigenous political traditions and contemporary democratic principles, creating distinctive governmental systems that reflect both historical legacies and contemporary political aspirations. The evaluation of Portuguese imperial economic and social consequences requires recognition of both the exploitation and suffering that imperial expansion caused, and the cultural exchanges and institutional developments that created positive legacies for contemporary development. The transformation of imperial relationships into cooperative partnerships based on mutual respect and shared benefit demonstrates possibilities for addressing historical injustices, while building constructive relationships that support development and cultural preservation throughout the Portuguese-speaking world. The contemporary assessment of Portuguese imperial history reveals fundamental tensions between nationalist narratives that celebrate Portuguese achievements in global exploration and cultural synthesis, and critical analyses that emphasize the exploitation, violence, and cultural destruction that accompanied imperial expansion, creating ongoing debates about historical memory that reflect broader international discussions about colonial legacies and their implications for contemporary politics and culture. Portuguese society's relationship with its imperial past involves complex negotiations between pride in historical achievements and recognition of historical injustices, while former Portuguese territories develop their own interpretations of colonial experience that emphasize African, Asian, and American agency and resistance alongside acknowledgement of Portuguese cultural influences that continue to shape contemporary identity and development. The historiographical evolution of Portuguese imperial studies reflects changing academic methodologies and political perspectives that have transformed scholarly understanding of imperial relationships from heroic narratives of discovery and civilization to more complex analyses of cultural encounter, economic exploitation, and political resistance that acknowledge multiple perspectives and experiences. Early Portuguese imperial historiography, developed during the Estado Novo period, emphasized Portuguese achievements in global exploration and cultural synthesis, while minimizing discussion of slavery, exploitation, and indigenous resistance. Contemporary scholarship has developed more balanced approaches that examine imperial relationships from multiple perspectives, while utilizing new sources and methodological approaches that reveal previously marginalized voices and experiences. Museum presentations and cultural institutions throughout the Portuguese-speaking world reflect ongoing negotiations about imperial memory, as curators and cultural authorities attempt to present imperial history in ways that acknowledge both achievements and injustices while serving diverse audiences with different relationships to imperial legacies. The National Museum of Ancient Art in Lisbon houses remarkable collections of imperial art and artifacts that demonstrate Portuguese global connections while raising questions about cultural appropriation and the circumstances under which these objects were acquired. Brazilian museums have developed presentations of colonial history that emphasize African and indigenous contributions to national development, while acknowledging Portuguese political and cultural influences. The challenge of presenting imperial history in ways that promote understanding and reconciliation, rather than defensiveness or resentment, requires careful attention to multiple perspectives and ongoing dialogue between different communities affected by imperial legacies. Educational curricula throughout the Portuguese-speaking world reflect different national priorities and perspectives in teaching imperial history, as Portuguese schools emphasize national achievements in global exploration, while former colonies develop educational approaches that combine acknowledgement of Portuguese influences with emphasis on indigenous resistance and post-independence development. The development of comparative approaches to imperial history that examine Portuguese expansion within broader contexts of European colonialism provides opportunities for more balanced understanding, while avoiding both excessive nationalism and historical nihilism that fails to recognize genuine achievements alongside acknowledged injustices. Contemporary political debates about immigration, multiculturalism, and European integration in Portugal reflect ongoing negotiations about national identity that must address both imperial legacies and contemporary realities of globalization and European membership. The integration of immigrants from former Portuguese territories into Portuguese society creates opportunities for maintaining cultural connections while requiring adaptation to contemporary Portuguese social and economic conditions. The challenge of building inclusive national identity that acknowledges imperial history while embracing contemporary diversity requires political leadership and social dialogue that can address historical grievances while building constructive relationships for future cooperation and development. International academic collaboration between Portuguese and international scholars has created opportunities for developing more comprehensive understanding of imperial history that utilizes sources and perspectives from multiple countries and cultures while maintaining scholarly standards and methodological rigor. The establishment of research centers and academic programs devoted to Portuguese imperial studies in various countries has facilitated comparative research that examines Portuguese expansion within broader contexts of global historical development. The availability of digitized historical sources and new communication technologies has enabled international scholarly collaboration that would have been impossible during previous periods, creating possibilities for more comprehensive and balanced historical understanding. Literary and artistic works that address imperial themes demonstrate ongoing cultural engagement with imperial memory as writers, filmmakers, and artists throughout the Portuguese-speaking world explore imperial legacies through creative expression that can reach broader audiences than academic scholarship, while providing emotional and aesthetic dimensions to historical understanding. Portuguese authors like Antonio Lobo Antunes and José Saramago have addressed colonial war experiences and imperial legacies through literary works that combine personal experience with broader historical reflection. African and Brazilian authors have developed literary traditions that examine colonial experiences from indigenous perspectives, while utilizing Portuguese language and literary forms to create distinctive cultural expressions that transform imperial legacies into contemporary artistic achievement. Tourism development throughout former Portuguese territories utilizes imperial historical sites and cultural attractions, while creating economic opportunities that can support heritage preservation and community development. The marketing of colonial architecture, historical sites, and cultural traditions as tourist attractions creates both opportunities for economic development and challenges related to cultural commodification and historical interpretation. The development of cultural tourism that provides accurate historical information while respecting local communities and cultural traditions requires careful planning and ongoing dialogue between tourism developers, local communities, and cultural authorities. The diplomatic relationships between Portugal and former Portuguese territories demonstrate possibilities for transforming imperial legacies into cooperative partnerships that address historical grievances while building constructive relationships for contemporary cooperation and mutual benefit. The Community of Portuguese Language Countries, CPLP, provides institutional frameworks for cooperation that respect national sovereignty while facilitating cultural, educational, and economic collaboration. The success of these post-colonial diplomatic relationships depends on mutual respect, recognition of historical injustices, and commitment to addressing contemporary challenges through cooperative rather than paternalistic approaches. The ongoing challenge of assessing Portuguese imperial history requires continued scholarly research, public education, and cultural dialogue that can acknowledge both achievements and injustices, while contributing to broader understanding of imperial legacies and their contemporary implications. The Portuguese imperial experience provides valuable insights into processes of cultural encounter, economic integration, and political transformation that remain relevant for understanding contemporary globalization and cultural diversity. The development of balanced historical assessment that avoids both uncritical celebration and wholesale condemnation, while contributing to constructive dialogue about historical legacies and contemporary challenges, represents an ongoing scholarly and cultural project that requires sustained commitment and international cooperation. The ultimate evaluation of Portuguese imperial legacy must balance recognition of genuine cultural achievements and historical significance with acknowledgement of exploitation and suffering, while contributing to contemporary efforts to build more equitable and cooperative international relationships that can address historical injustices and support human development throughout the global community. As the night settles around you and consciousness begins its gentle retreat towards sleep, consider the extraordinary scope of human ambition contained within this single imperial story. 6 centuries of expansion and contraction, of dreams realized and empires dissolved, of small beginnings that grew to encompass continents before returning once again to their modest origins on Europe's Atlantic edge. The Portuguese Empire, stretching across time from Prince Henry's windswept castle at Sagres in 1415 to the final lowering of the Portuguese flag in Macau in 1999, spanned nearly 600 years of human history, making it the longest-lived European colonial empire and one of the most geographically extensive political entities ever created by human ambition and navigational skill. The temporal dimension of Portuguese expansion challenges our contemporary understanding of historical change, as we live in an era where political transformations occur within years or decades, making it difficult to comprehend institutional continuity that persisted across centuries of technological, social, and cultural evolution. When Portuguese navigators first rounded Cape Bojador in 1434, Europe was still emerging from medieval social organization, while the final Portuguese withdrawal from East Timor occurred in an era of satellite communication and global economic integration. The administrative systems that governed Portuguese Goa remained fundamentally consistent from Afonso de Albuquerque's conquest in 1510 until Indian incorporation in 1961, a span of 4.5 centuries during which European civilization experienced the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, industrialization, and the emergence of democratic governance. The geographical scope of Portuguese influence at its imperial zenith encompassed territories and populations that defied conventional understanding of political organization and administrative control. From the fortress of Ceuta on Morocco's Mediterranean coast to the trading post of Nagasaki in Japan, from the sugar plantations of Pernambuco to the ivory markets of Mozambique, Portuguese officials exercised authority over territories separated by oceanic distances that required months to traverse using contemporary transportation technology. The logistics of coordinating imperial policy across such distances, managing commercial relationships with dozens of different cultural and political systems, and maintaining military control over territories whose combined population far exceeded that of metropolitan Portugal, represented administrative achievements that rival any comparable enterprise in human history. Yet the human scale of Portuguese expansion remained remarkably modest throughout most of the imperial period, as the kingdom's limited population required colonial administration that relied heavily on local accommodation, cultural adaptation, and commercial partnership rather than direct territorial control and population replacement that characterized some other European colonial enterprises. Portuguese colonial settlements rarely involved large-scale European migration, comparable to the demographic transformations that occurred in North America or Australia, instead creating colonial societies characterized by cultural mixing and administrative flexibility that enabled Portuguese influence to persist, despite numerical disadvantages that would have made purely coercive control impossible. The cyclical nature of imperial expansion and contraction reveals fundamental patterns of human ambition and institutional limitation that transcend specific cultural and historical contexts. Portuguese expansion during the 15th and 16th centuries reflected the convergence of technological capability, political organization, and economic opportunity that enabled a small European kingdom to establish global influence, while Portuguese imperial decline during subsequent centuries demonstrated the practical limitations of maintaining extensive territorial control across oceanic distances with limited demographic and economic resources. The rhythm of expansion and contraction, achievement and loss, glory and decline that characterize Portuguese imperial history reflects broader patterns of human enterprise that suggest both the remarkable capabilities and ultimate limitations of human political organization. The environmental and ecological dimensions of Portuguese expansion created changes in global biological and agricultural systems that persist centuries after the end of Portuguese political control, demonstrating how human imperial enterprises can produce consequences that exceed their intended scope and duration. The circulation of crops, animals, and diseases through Portuguese commercial networks contributed to what historians call the Columbian Exchange, fundamentally altering agricultural production, population distribution, and ecological relationships across multiple continents. The introduction of American crops into African agriculture, the transfer of Asian spices to American territories, and the movement of African agricultural techniques to American plantations created lasting changes in global food systems that continue to influence contemporary agricultural production and food security. The demographic consequences of Portuguese expansion, including both voluntary migration and forced population transfers through the slave trade, created population distributions and cultural characteristics that persist as fundamental aspects of contemporary global society. The Portuguese role in transporting millions of enslaved Africans to American destinations created African diaspora communities whose cultural contributions continue to influence music, religion, cuisine, and artistic expression throughout the Americas. Simultaneously, Portuguese colonial settlement and cultural mixing created distinctive societies in Asia, Africa, and America, whose multicultural characteristics reflect centuries of cultural encounter and adaptation initiated during the imperial period. The intellectual and cultural legacies of Portuguese expansion include not merely the preservation of Portuguese language and cultural practices throughout former imperial territories, but also the creation of new forms of cultural expression that synthesized elements from multiple continental traditions while developing distinctive characteristics adapted to specific local conditions. The architectural styles, musical traditions, culinary practices, and literary forms that emerged from Portuguese colonial cultural synthesis represent creative achievements that transcended their origins in imperial relationships to become independent cultural traditions that continue to evolve and influence global cultural development. The central paradox of Portuguese imperial history, how a nation whose population never exceeded 10 million people during the height of its expansion came to influence the development of societies and cultures across 4 continents, illuminates fundamental questions about the relationship between national resources, strategic advantages, and historical opportunity that extend far beyond Portuguese experience to encompass broader patterns of global influence and cultural transformation. Portugal's achievement in creating the world's first global maritime empire while remaining one of Europe's smaller and less economically developed kingdoms demonstrates that historical impact cannot be measured simply through conventional indicators of national power such as population size, military strength, or economic production. Geographic location provided Portugal with strategic advantages that enabled the kingdom to achieve global influence disproportionate to its demographic and economic resources, as its position on Europe's Atlantic periphery, initially seeming disadvantageous compared to Mediterranean commercial centres, ultimately provided crucial advantages for oceanic exploration and commercial expansion. Portuguese ports faced the open Atlantic rather than enclosed seas, while the kingdom's extensive coastline and maritime cultural traditions provided population groups with navigational skills and oceanic experience that proved invaluable when systematic exploration moved beyond European coastal waters. The convergence of geographic advantage with technological innovation and political organization created opportunities for global expansion that larger and more populous European kingdoms could not initially exploit due to their different geographic positions and cultural orientations. Cultural adaptability represented another crucial factor in Portuguese global success, as the kingdom's experience with cultural diversity during the medieval Reconquista provided precedents for accommodation with non-European societies that enabled Portuguese expansion to rely on commercial partnership and cultural synthesis rather than purely coercive control. Portuguese colonial societies typically developed through intermarriage, cultural mixing, and administrative flexibility that created distinctive colonial cultures while maintaining Portuguese political and commercial influence. This adaptive approach enabled Portuguese influence to persist in territories where purely European settlements might have failed due to environmental challenges, demographic disadvantages, or indigenous resistance. The decentralized nature of Portuguese imperial administration created additional advantages for maintaining global influence despite limited metropolitan resources, as Portuguese colonial officials exercised substantial autonomy in adapting imperial policies to local conditions while maintaining commercial and political relationships with the imperial centre. Portuguese trading posts and colonial settlements functioned as networks of semi-autonomous entities, connected through commercial relationships and cultural affinities, rather than rigid administrative hierarchies that would have required constant supervision and resource investment from metropolitan authorities. This flexibility enabled Portuguese influence to adapt to changing local conditions, while maintaining essential connections that sustained imperial relationships across oceanic distances and centuries of political change. Economic specialization in high-value, low-volume trade enabled Portugal to maximize returns on limited investment, while avoiding direct competition with larger European powers in territorial conquest and population settlement. Portuguese concentration on spice trade, precious metals, and other luxury goods created commercial relationships that generated substantial profits without requiring extensive territorial control or large-scale European migration. This commercial strategy enabled Portuguese influence to extend far beyond what the kingdom's limited resources could have achieved through territorial colonization, while creating economic relationships that attracted local cooperation rather than requiring continuous military coercion. The timing of Portuguese expansion coincided with technological and political developments that created unique opportunities for oceanic exploration and global commercial expansion, enabling Portuguese navigators to establish global precedents in maritime exploration before larger European powers recognized the opportunities available through oceanic expansion. Portuguese achievement in rounding Africa and reaching Asia by sea provided decades of competitive advantage in global commerce, while establishing commercial and political relationships that persisted even after other European powers entered Asian and American markets. The Portuguese imperial experience demonstrates that historical influence results from complex interactions between geographic opportunity, cultural innovation, political organization, and historical timing rather than simple demographic or economic advantages. Small nations can achieve global influence through strategic specialization, cultural adaptability, and effective utilization of geographic and historical opportunities that larger powers may initially overlook or fail to exploit effectively. The Portuguese precedent suggests that national impact should be measured not merely through conventional power indicators, but through cultural influence, institutional innovation, and lasting contributions to global development that may persist long after political power has declined. In these final moments before sleep claims your conscious attention, let the rhythm of centuries wash over you like gentle waves against an ancient shore, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom and folly of 600 years of human ambition, discovery, exploitation, and ultimate transformation. The Portuguese Empire, like all human enterprises, was simultaneously magnificent and terrible, noble and base, creative and destructive, a mirror reflecting the full complexity of human nature, projected across oceanic distances and historical time. As your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to drift, consider how this single imperial story contains multitudes. The courage of explorers venturing beyond known horizons, the cruelty of slave traders destroying African communities, the ingenuity of administrators governing territories they could barely imagine, the creativity of cultures mixing and adapting in ways their creators never anticipated. The merchants who loaded spices in the warehouses of 16th century Lisbon could not have foreseen that their commercial networks would create the cultural foundations for modern Brazil, just as the African captives forced onto slave ships could not have imagined that their descendants would preserve and transform African cultural traditions in American settings that would eventually influence global music, religion, and artistic expression. The Portuguese navigators who established trading posts along the Indian Ocean could not have predicted that their modest commercial settlements would evolve into distinctive cultural communities that would persist for centuries, while the colonial administrators who governed vast territories from European capitals could never have fully understood the complex societies they were attempting to control through instruments of policy created thousands of miles away. The ultimate lesson of Portuguese imperial history may be that human institutions, no matter how carefully planned or forcefully imposed, inevitably develop according to their own internal logic and local conditions, rather than following the intentions of their creators. Portuguese colonies became Brazilian, Angolan, Mozambican, and Macanese societies that preserved Portuguese cultural elements, while developing distinctive characteristics that reflected their specific historical experiences and cultural syntheses. The Portuguese language itself evolved differently in different territories, incorporating local vocabulary and developing distinctive grammatical features that reflected the particular linguistic environments in which Portuguese-speaking communities developed and flourished. This process of cultural transformation and adaptation continues in the present day, as Portuguese-speaking communities throughout the world maintain connections with their Portuguese linguistic and cultural heritage, while developing contemporary expressions that address their specific conditions and aspirations. The community of Portuguese language countries provides institutional frameworks for cooperation and cultural exchange that respect national sovereignty, while celebrating shared linguistic and cultural traditions that originated during the imperial period but have evolved far beyond their colonial origins. The environmental legacy of Portuguese expansion serves as a reminder that human actions create consequences that extend far beyond their immediate purposes and persist long after their original contexts have disappeared. The plants, animals, and agricultural techniques that circulated through Portuguese commercial networks continue to influence global food production, while the architectural styles and artistic traditions that developed in Portuguese territories contribute to contemporary cultural diversity and creative expression. Perhaps the most profound lesson of Portuguese imperial history is that human societies possess remarkable capacities for both creation and destruction, often simultaneously and within the same institutional frameworks and cultural systems. The same maritime expertise that enabled Portuguese navigators to connect distant continents also facilitated the transportation of millions of enslaved Africans, while the cultural adaptability that created distinctive colonial societies also enabled systematic exploitation of indigenous populations and resources. Understanding this complexity requires acknowledgement of both achievements and injustices, while recognizing that historical evaluation must encompass the full range of human experience rather than reducing complex historical processes to simple moral judgments. As sleep finally embraces you, let the story of Portuguese expansion remind you that human history unfolds across scales of time and space that exceed individual comprehension, creating legacies that persist in unexpected forms while demonstrating both the remarkable achievements and ultimate limitations of human ambition and institutional creativity. The rise and fall of empires, like the rhythm of ocean tides, follows patterns that reveal fundamental aspects of human nature, while creating conditions for future developments that no single generation can fully anticipate or control. The Portuguese sailed into history's vast ocean, and history, like the sea itself, transformed them, even as they sought to transform it. Now, as consciousness recedes like an evening tide, rest peacefully in the knowledge that their story, like all human stories, continues to unfold in ways both subtle and profound, carried forward by currents as deep and enduring as human hope itself.